Hey there, welcome to a cozy crime story. Tonight, we are diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime, real stories of mysteries, betrayal, and cold-blooded crime, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now, settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. The night air was unusually still in the quiet suburbs of Birmingham, Alabama. Streetlights lined the roads, their glow reflecting softly off the sidewalks, but no one walked beneath them. Inside one of the well-maintained homes, Serafina Holloway sat at a polished oak desk, her eyes scanning documents with a precision that suggested a mind always several steps ahead. To the outside world, she was composed, successful, and admired, a woman whose intellect and poise seemed unshakable. Neighbors spoke of the Holloways with admiration. Serafina and her husband, Orrin, were seen as the ideal couple. Their smiles were genuine, their gestures thoughtful, their lives orderly. People assumed their happiness was effortless, their love seamless. Few would have guessed that beneath the surface of this calm, measured life, ambition and desire quietly simmered, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Serafina's brilliance had earned her accolades in the corporate world. Her decisions were swift yet deliberate, earning the respect of colleagues and competitors alike. Orrin, a disciplined and respected officer of the local police department, was her partner in both life and social recognition. Together they seemed untouchable, a combination of charm, intellect, and stability that few could rival. But even the most perfect exteriors can hide tension. Late glances, unspoken thoughts, and subtle frustrations lingered between them, unnoticed by the world but ever present in their home. Serafina understood more than anyone the value of control, yet she also recognized the quiet stirrings of restlessness within herself. She leaned back in her chair, a faint smile touching her lips. There was a challenge ahead, a test not of skill or intellect alone, but of desire, choice, and consequence. And in the shadows of that anticipation, the story of her life, her marriage, and the decisions she would make began to unfold. Have you ever felt that quiet ache of longing? Something you can't name but know is pulling at your heart. That sense that life has settled into a rhythm so familiar it almost feels suffocating. Serafina knew it well. Despite the admiration, the success, and the apparent perfection of her world, there was a small, persistent yearning she could not ignore. She craved more than stability. She craved recognition of her desires, of her ambitions, of her very self. For many in small towns, life can seem predictable: work, home, family, community. Yet, even within the boundaries of routine, human hearts can wander, and minds can dream of possibilities that the everyday cannot contain. Serafina's restlessness was subtle at first, a lingering gaze out the window, a pause in conversation, a question left unasked. But it was enough to set her apart from those around her. Orrin loved her, undeniably. He noticed the occasional distant look, the subtle shifts in her demeanor. Yet, he believed it was just fatigue, the result of her demanding career. Few could have imagined the intensity behind her composure, the careful calculation of every thought and action that masked the stirring of her inner world. It is in these quiet, ordinary moments that extraordinary stories often begin. Moments when desire meets opportunity, and when ambition collides with moral choice. And it is here, in the silent spaces between heartbeats, that Serafina's journey, both brilliant and unsettling, would begin to take shape. Beneath the calm of Serafina's life, subtle currents of ambition began to stir. In the well-lit rooms of the Holloway residence, she meticulously reviewed every detail of her professional and personal existence. Every choice, every interaction, every glance seemed deliberate, yet always calculated towards something larger, a freedom and fulfillment that Orrin could not provide, no matter how devoted he was. It was not dissatisfaction alone that shaped her thinking. It was the recognition of opportunity. There were people who came into her life unexpectedly, offering glimpses of challenge and excitement. Among them was someone whose intellect mirrored her own, someone who could ignite the passions that had long lain dormant beneath layers of routine. This quiet entanglement began not with drama, but with conversation, subtle admiration, and the thrilling awareness that life could stretch beyond its comfortable bounds. Even in the earliest stages, there was a tension that could not be ignored. Every decision she considered, every longing she allowed herself, carried weight. One small step toward desire could unravel the security that had defined her life for years. Yet Serafina felt an irresistible pull toward the unknown, a willingness to consider choices that were at once intoxicating and morally challenging. Her ambition, once contained within corporate strategies and professional pursuit, began to stretch into the personal sphere. It whispered possibilities that were as daring as they were dangerous, hinting at actions that, if discovered, could shock everyone who believed they knew her. This was the moment when the calm surface of suburban life began to ripple, as the first hints of betrayal and morally complex decisions emerged from the quiet shadows. Have you ever wondered how far someone would go for love, or for the fulfillment of a desire that feels just beyond reach? That question lingered in Serafina's mind as she navigated her orderly life. She was a woman who valued precision, intellect, and composure, but she also understood that the human heart does not always follow logic. It was not enough to consider what was right or safe. She constantly asked herself what was possible, what could be achieved if one were bold enough, careful enough, and clever enough to seize it. The boundaries between morality and personal fulfillment blurred with every passing day. Each choice she contemplated carried consequences, yet each also promised liberation and intensity she had never experienced. Serafina's dilemma was one that quietly challenged the audience. When desire conflicts with duty, when ambition whispers while loyalty holds, how does a person decide which path to follow? The question was not academic. It was personal, urgent, and unrelenting. And it was precisely this tension, this moral uncertainty, that would drive the extraordinary events unfolding in the Holloway household. Every glance, every interaction, every small decision became a test. Could Serafina maintain the appearance of the perfect spouse while pursuing ambitions and desires that few could even imagine? Could she navigate a world in which intellect, charm, and secrecy became tools in a game that had no clear rules, only consequences? As the night deepened, the quiet of her home belied the intensity of her thoughts. Serafina's mind raced with possibilities, and with each careful calculation the story was set in motion. The audience is invited to watch closely, to question what they would do in her position, and to consider the delicate balance between desire, ambition, and morality. It began innocuously, a chance meeting that Serafina could not have anticipated. Among the routines of her life, there appeared someone whose presence seemed to mirror the curiosity and ambition she carried within herself. Lucian Kellen was a man who challenged her, not through force or demand, but through conversation, wit, and the intensity of his ideas. He became a spark in the steady glow of her ordered world, a reminder that the ordinary could conceal extraordinary possibilities. Their discussions were measured, yet magnetic. They spoke of ideas, ambitions, and experiences that few outside their circle could grasp. In those moments, Serafina felt both exhilaration and a subtle unease, aware that the connection she was forming might shift the balance of everything she had built. It was not a reckless attraction, but a deliberate, quiet fascination, a bond that stirred her intellect and her heart simultaneously. Even small gestures carried meaning. A knowing glance over a shared document, a smile that lingered just a moment longer than expected, a thoughtful question that hinted at understanding her in ways Oren never could. Each interaction, while subtle, increased the tension in her life, drawing her toward decisions she had not yet fully considered. This connection also posed a silent test to the audience. How does one recognize the difference between mere companionship and a force that has the power to change the course of one's life. In Serafina's case, every word, every pause, every exchange became a layer of intrigue, slowly entwining her personal desires with ambitions she had long kept beneath the surface. And in that quiet, precise way, the stage was set. The audience witnesses the initial threads of a story where intellect, desire, and restraint will collide, revealing how even the most composed lives can hold moments of extraordinary tension. Even in the calm of the Holloway home, the threads of Serafina's life were shifting. Every choice carried weight, and every moment of indecision risked consequences she had not yet fully imagined. Though Orrin remained devoted, the subtle cracks in their marriage had begun to appear. Small pauses in conversation, fleeting glances of distraction, unanswered questions that hovered like silent warnings. Serafina was keenly aware that ambition and desire, if left unchecked, could lead to outcomes she might not control. The stakes were high. Her reputation, her relationships, her carefully constructed life, all balanced on the precision of her decisions. Each day brought opportunities and risks, a quiet tension that seemed invisible to everyone around her, yet impossible for her to ignore. Lucien's presence added another layer of complexity. While their connection provided exhilaration, it also demanded caution. Every interaction required subtlety, every word measured, the thrill of possibility, intertwined with the necessity of discretion, creating an undercurrent of suspense that threaded through her daily routine. The audience is invited to feel the tension alongside her. How does one navigate the delicate balance between desire and discretion, between longing and loyalty? And as Serafina contemplated her next moves, the question lingered. Could brilliance, strategy, and careful planning truly shield her from the consequences of choices driven by the heart as well as the mind? In these quiet, calculated moments, the foundation for extraordinary events was being laid. What seemed ordinary on the surface, dinners, meetings, smiles exchanged in passing, was in fact a stage for decisions that would challenge expectations and test limits. The subtle suspense promised to unfold into a story both riveting and morally complex. As the night deepened over Birmingham, Serafina Holloway leaned back in her chair and allowed herself a quiet, measured smile. The life she had meticulously built appeared flawless from the outside, yet within the quiet of her home, a story of ambition, desire, and moral complexity was quietly taking shape, one that would challenge the very limits of love, loyalty, and intellect. The audience is invited to witness this unfolding drama, to consider the choices they might make if faced with similar tension between heart and conscience. How far would you go to achieve fulfillment when the world expects nothing less than perfection? Could brilliance alone navigate the intricate dance of desire, secrecy, and consequence? Every glance, every whispered thought, every careful step that Serafina takes now carries meaning. What she does next will ripple through her life, her marriage, and the quiet community around her. And while no one can predict how she will act, the journey promises intrigue, emotional depth, and lessons about the cost of ambition and the power of personal choice. Before we continue, I invite you to engage with this story. Like the video if you are captivated, comment below with your thoughts on the choices Serafina faces, and subscribe to follow every twist of this remarkable tale. This is more than a story. It is a reflection on how intelligence, desire, and morality intersect in ways that challenge us all. The stage is set. The characters are in motion. And now, the true story of Serafina Holloway begins. One that will reveal not only the limits of human ambition, but also the depth of human longing, and the extraordinary consequences that arise when they collide. Serafina Holloway was a woman whose intelligence had been evident from an early age. Growing up, she had been attentive, analytical, and fiercely determined. She excelled in school, her teachers remarking on her ability to grasp complex concepts with ease and to express ideas with clarity beyond her years. These traits carried into her adulthood, shaping not only her career but also the way she navigated the world. Her professional life was one of accomplishment and respect. As a corporate strategist, Serafina had built a reputation for precision, creativity, and the ability to anticipate outcomes before they unfolded. Boardrooms and conference halls became stages for her intellect, and her insights often influenced decisions that affected thousands. Yet, for all her professional success, there remained a part of her life where she sought fulfillment in a realm that could not be measured in charts or reports. Even as she pursued excellence in her career, Serafina understood the power of presentation. She moved through her world with grace and poise, aware that perception often shaped reality. This awareness allowed her to maintain a facade of perfection while quietly exploring ambitions and desires that most would have overlooked. Every detail mattered: the tone of her voice, the way she greeted colleagues, the subtleties of her wardrobe. Each decision reinforced her carefully curated presence. Beyond her professional achievements, Serafina's mind thrived on challenges. She read voraciously, studied patterns, and analyzed behaviors with an instinctive precision. Her intellect was both her shield and her instrument, enabling her to navigate complex social dynamics, anticipate obstacles, and recognize opportunities that others missed. Yet, despite all these accomplishments, Serafina was acutely aware of an inner restlessness. There were moments when routine seemed confining, when predictable outcomes felt limiting. These small stirrings, the faint pull toward experiences uncharted, were what made her story compelling, for they would eventually guide her toward choices that few could have anticipated. Orrin Holloway was a man defined by discipline, integrity, and a quiet sense of duty. From the early days of his career in law enforcement, he had earned respect not through spectacle or showmanship, but through consistent reliability and an unwavering commitment to his responsibilities. Within the police department, his colleagues trusted his judgment, while the community appreciated his presence as a symbol of stability and safety. At home, Orrin's demeanor was calm and steady. He valued structure and predictability, believing that the foundation of any strong relationship rested on trust, consistency, and mutual respect. In his eyes, Serafina's brilliance was both inspiring and reassuring, a partner whose intellect complemented his own grounded perspective. Together, they projected an image of harmony that few dared to question. Yet even the most devoted spouse cannot see every subtle shift in a partner's heart. Orrin noticed the occasional pauses in Serafina's conversation, the fleeting moments of distraction, but he attributed them to work stress or fatigue. He never suspected that beneath her composed exterior, a complex web of ambition and yearning was beginning to take shape. Despite these small cracks, Orrin remained deeply committed. He cared for Serafina with a sincerity that demanded acknowledgement, often going out of his way to anticipate her needs, offer support, and create a home filled with warmth. His loyalty was unquestionable, a constant in a world that could sometimes feel uncertain. This unwavering devotion, however, would prove to be both a comfort and a challenge. While Orrin's presence provided stability, it also contrasted sharply with the stirring desires and ambitions that were quietly awakening within Serafina. And it was this contrast, the balance between devotion and longing, that would eventually drive the tension at the heart of their story. Years of routine had a way of settling over even the most carefully cultivated relationships. For Serafina and Orrin Holloway, the early days of excitement and discovery had gradually given way to predictability. Their life together was comfortable, orderly, and admired by everyone who observed it. But comfort, while reassuring, can sometimes dull the spark that first drew two people together. Late dinners became a quiet ritual rather than a shared experience. Weekends, once filled with spontaneous outings or thoughtful gestures, were now measured and methodical. Work obligations occupied long stretches of time, and conversations often revolved around schedules, errands, or logistical concerns. Within this routine, Serafina began to feel a subtle sense of invisibility, as though her ambitions and desires were acknowledged only in passing, if at all. Orrin, for his part, noticed occasional changes. pauses in her gaze, quiet reflections at unexpected moments, but interpreted them as fatigue or the natural ebb and flow of marriage. He remained devoted, assuming that their bond was unshakable, that the love they shared could withstand the quiet pressures of daily life. Yet even as he worked to maintain stability, he was unaware of the internal stirrings within Serafina, the longing for recognition, for excitement, and for connection beyond the familiar patterns of their household. It is often in these subtle shifts, small gestures overlooked, conversations left incomplete, that the tension of a story quietly builds. The Holloway's marriage, while outwardly perfect, contained the early hints of divergence, moments when desire and ambition began to stretch against the boundaries of loyalty and routine. Serafina's awareness of her own restlessness, coupled with Oren's unintentional blind spots, created a fertile ground for the events that were quietly taking shape, unseen by those around them. This is where the audience begins to sense the complexity of the situation. Relationships are rarely as simple as they appear, and even the most devoted partnership can contain moments of unspoken yearning. The foundation is still strong, but the subtle cracks are now visible to those paying careful attention. Even amid outward perfection, Serafina felt a quiet tension that refused to be ignored. It was not dissatisfaction with her marriage alone. It was a deeper stirring, a curiosity about life's possibilities beyond the confines of routine and expectation. She found herself reflecting on moments when she had acted purely on instinct, on ideas that challenged convention, or on choices that demanded courage. These recollections, though fleeting, ignited a subtle restlessness that no achievement or accolade could fully satisfy. At work, her mind thrived on challenge and strategy, but even the highest level of professional success left gaps in her personal fulfillment. Serafina longed for connection and recognition on a different level, something that appealed not just to intellect but to the heart, something that evoked passion alongside admiration. This quiet yearning, carefully contained, began to shape the way she viewed her life, her relationships, and her possibilities. The small deviations she allowed herself in thought became increasingly significant. A lingering glance, an imagined conversation with someone who could match her wit, or a subtle indulgence in daydreams about alternate paths. All were private acts of exploration. Serafina recognized these stirrings as both exhilarating and dangerous. They reminded her that life could be more than stability, that ambition could extend beyond the professional sphere into the personal, and that desire could quietly challenge loyalty without ever revealing itself outright. This inner conflict was invisible to Oren and most of those around her. Yet it shaped every decision she made, every smile she offered, and every moment she chose to remain composed. For the audience, this is the first clear sign that Serafina's brilliance carries not only accomplishment, but also moral complexity, a subtle tension between aspiration and restraint that will define much of the story to come. Serafina's brilliance was not only evident in her career, but in the way she managed every facet of her life with precision. Her routines were intentional, each day structured to maximize efficiency, opportunity, and control. She tracked details others might overlook, schedules, interactions, the subtleties of human behavior. Her mind operated like a finely tuned instrument, capable of analyzing complex situations while maintaining poise and composure in the moment. Her habits reflected a deep awareness of cause and effect. Conversations were not merely exchanges of words, they were opportunities to observe, to interpret motives, to anticipate reactions. Meetings were approached as puzzles, challenges to be understood and resolved with intellect rather than impulse. Even at home, Serafina's attentiveness manifested subtly. She noticed the tone in Oren's voice, the shift of expression across his face, the unspoken cues that hinted at concerns or unvoiced thoughts. Yet this precision was paired with creativity. She had the rare ability to merge logic and intuition, to approach problems with both analytical rigor and imaginative insight. It allowed her to see possibilities where others saw limits, and it enabled her to consider scenarios that were complex, nuanced, and often morally ambiguous. The audience begins to understand that this combination of intellect, observation, and foresight is what makes Serafina extraordinary, but also what sets the stage for tension. The same skills that bring success can also bring challenge, especially when human desire enters the equation. Her brilliance is both a gift and a responsibility, and the choices she makes in the coming chapters will reveal how these traits interact with longing, ambition, and the subtle pressures of life that even the most careful individual cannot fully control. To the neighbors, colleagues, and friends who observed the Holloways, their life seemed flawless. Invitations to dinners, community events, and professional gatherings showcased Serafina and Oren as a couple of intellect, elegance, and stability. Their interactions were polished, their manners impeccable, and their presence reassuring, a representation of harmony that others admired and sometimes envied. Yet the perception of perfection can conceal subtle tensions. Behind closed doors, conversations that seemed seamless to outsiders sometimes carried undercurrents of doubt, quiet longing, or unspoken frustration. Oren's devotion and Serafina's composure masked the small but persistent stirrings of her personal desires, leaving the world unaware of the growing complexity beneath the surface. Social gatherings became arenas where Serafina's skill at observation and careful navigation shone. She noticed details others ignored, a colleague's hesitation, a friend's unspoken sentiment, or a subtle shift in tone that suggested opportunity or risk. While her public presence suggested confidence and warmth, her mind was actively analyzing, anticipating, and evaluating, a duality invisible to those around her. For the audience, this contrast creates intrigue. The more flawless the exterior, the more compelling the story becomes when internal conflicts begin to influence choices. The Holloways' social life, while seemingly perfect, serves as both a stage and a mirror, reflecting the subtle tension between appearances and reality, loyalty and longing, stability and ambition. Even the most admired lives have layers, and it is within these layers that human complexity reveals itself. For Serafina, the gap between perception and truth would play a critical role in the decisions she would make, setting the stage for the moral and emotional challenges to come. Beneath the calm of their household, a quiet tension began to take shape. Serafina's restlessness, Oren's devotion, and the subtle intricacies of their daily life combined to create a delicate balance, one that could be disrupted by even the smallest choice. The audience begins to sense that the perfection everyone admired might conceal a growing divergence, a tension that could soon tip into unexpected consequences. Serafina's thoughts were often occupied with questions she rarely voiced. How much of life should one live for duty versus desire? How far could one go in pursuit of personal fulfillment without crossing boundaries that could never be undone? These internal struggles, though invisible to Oren and the community, were shaping her decisions and influencing every interaction, every glance, every moment of stillness in her home. At the same time, Oren remained unaware of the depth of her internal conflict. His loyalty, integrity, and care created a safety net that Serafina leaned on, even as her ambitions and desires pulled her in different directions. The contrast between their inner worlds set the stage for suspense, moral tension, and the difficult choices that would define the coming story. For the audience, the intrigue lies not just in what is happening, but in what might happen. Every small decision, every withheld thought, and every fleeting emotion is a potential catalyst for dramatic consequences. The tension is quiet, but it hums beneath the surface, a subtle pulse that hints at the complexity and challenge of the events soon to unfold. This part of the chapter closes with a sense of anticipation. Serafina's brilliance, ambition, and emerging desires, set against Oren's steadfast presence, create a narrative poised on the edge of transformation. The audience is invited to continue with the story, aware that choices made in silence can echo with consequences far greater than anyone could foresee. Lucian Kellen had a presence that demanded attention without demanding it. He walked into any room with a quiet confidence, the kind born from surviving challenges that most could not imagine. His past was complex, marked by mistakes and miscalculations that had cost him years behind bars, yet the time had refined him rather than broken him. What emerged from those years was a man of cunning intellect, careful strategy, and an understanding of human nature that few possessed. Those who encountered him often felt simultaneously wary and intrigued. Lucian had learned to read people instinctively, the subtle inflections in their speech, the micro-expressions that betrayed hidden thoughts, and the inconsistencies that revealed unspoken truths. His charm was understated but potent. A single glance or a carefully chosen word could provoke curiosity, admiration, or unease. He knew precisely how to use perception to his advantage, making him a figure both magnetic and unpredictable. Lucian's past did not define him entirely, but it lent him a sharp edge. He had been forced to navigate a world of high stakes, deception, and survival, and the lessons lingered. Every decision, every observation, every interaction was measured, calculated, and purposeful. He had emerged from confinement with more than freedom. He had emerged with insight, strategy, and a quiet command of influence that was both unsettling and compelling to those who met him. For Serafina, encountering Lucian was a jolt to a mind long accustomed to order and precision. There was an instant recognition of intellect, a subtle thrill in discovering someone who not only matched her thinking, but challenged it. The audience begins to understand that this was no ordinary acquaintance. Lucian was a catalyst, a force that would ignite desires and ambitions Serafina had kept contained for years. Even in casual interactions, his charisma hinted at complexity. He did not boast, nor did he seek validation, yet his presence left a lingering impression. It was as if every gesture, every tone, and every careful silence carried meaning beyond the ordinary, a silent invitation to engage with a mind that was sharp, unpredictable, and undeniably compelling. The first moments between them were brief, almost ordinary, but charged with the subtle tension of possibility. The audience can feel the electricity of intellect meeting intellect, curiosity brushing against restraint, and the early tremors of a connection that would soon shift from fascination to something far more dangerous. The first conversation between Serafina and Lucian was deceptively simple. They discussed books, ideas, and theories, but beneath the surface lay a complex interplay of intellect and curiosity. Serafina found herself drawn to a mind that mirrored her own, someone capable of dissecting arguments, analyzing strategy, and appreciating nuance in ways few others could. Lucian, in turn, recognized a rare combination in Serafina: brilliance tempered by intuition, rigor tempered by empathy, and curiosity that was relentless yet measured. They spoke of philosophers who challenged morality and law, of authors who examined human nature with piercing insight, and of historical figures whose ambitions altered the course of their lives. These discussions were not casual. Each word was deliberate, each argument a subtle test of perception and understanding. Serafina realized quickly that Lucian's intellect was not only formidable, but dangerously adaptive. He could read a person as if their thoughts were written on a page, predicting reactions with unsettling precision. Ambition became a recurring theme in their exchanges. Lucian understood the hunger for more, the drive to achieve, to control, to transcend limits, and he recognized it in Serafina's eyes. Conversations that began with literature and theory gradually touched on strategy, choice, and the moral gray areas where intelligence and desire intersected. Each discussion left Serafina exhilarated, challenged, and aware that she had discovered someone who could expand her world in ways she had never considered. The audience begins to sense the subtle tension forming. Their intellectual exchanges were a dance of minds, a challenge that both delighted and unnerved Serafina. Every insight shared, every clever argument, became a step toward a connection that was as compelling as it was forbidden. Even in the quietest moments, a shared observation over coffee, a meaningful glance across the table, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of understanding. They were partners in a mental game, exploring territories that tested intellect, ambition, and the limits of conventional morality. For Serafina, this connection was intoxicating. It offered validation, challenge, and a sense of excitement that her daily life had long denied her. The subtlety of their bond was part of its power. It could exist in thought, conversation, or observation, leaving the world oblivious to the growing intrigue. Yet for the audience, it became clear that these interactions were more than intellectual exercises. They were the beginning of an entanglement that would complicate everything Serafina had known about loyalty, desire, and the consequences of crossing invisible boundaries. As their interactions continued, Serafina found herself thinking of Lucian in ways that surprised her. It was not just admiration for his intellect. It was an undercurrent of fascination that began to occupy her thoughts, even in moments when she was alone or with Oren. The subtle thrill of his presence, the sharpness of his insights, and the unspoken understanding between them began to create a tension she could not easily dismiss. Her loyalty to Oren weighed heavily on her conscience. She respected him deeply, valued their life together, and recognized the stability he provided. Yet the allure of Lucian's mind, the possibilities of connection beyond the predictable rhythms of her household, tugged at her in ways she could not ignore. It was a conflict between duty and desire, comfort and exhilaration, that gnawed at her steadily, quietly reshaping the contours of her thoughts. The obsession was not reckless, it was meticulous and controlled. Serafina would replay conversations, analyze his gestures, and consider the implications of their interactions. Each glance, each comment, each subtle shared insight became a touchstone for her inner dialogue. She questioned her feelings constantly, evaluating what was ethical, what was fleeting, and what might evolve into something far more consequential. For the audience, this tension is electric. Serafina is no longer simply drawn to Lucian. She is caught between two worlds, the stable, loyal existence with Oren, and the intellectual and emotional exhilaration she experiences with Lucian. The conflict is psychological, moral, and emotional, and it sets the stage for decisions that could have irreversible consequences. Even the simplest encounters became charged with meaning. A shared laugh in a cafe, a moment of recognition in a quiet conversation, or a lingering pause before responding, all became elements of a growing obsession that Serafina could neither fully embrace nor easily dismiss. The audience senses that this is more than fleeting curiosity. It is a connection that will challenge her values, ambitions, and heart. By allowing herself to dwell on these moments, Serafina began to understand that human desire is rarely simple. The pull of fascination, the thrill of understanding someone who reflects yet challenges your own mind, and the subtle, intoxicating allure of connection can create moral and emotional dilemmas of profound consequence. Their connection, while grounded in intellect, began to carry layers of intimacy that Serafina had not anticipated. It was never overt or reckless. It existed in fleeting moments, a shared smile, a pause in conversation, or the intensity of a glance that lingered just long enough to convey understanding without words. These subtle interactions created a rhythm, an unspoken language that bound them in a way that was both thrilling and dangerous. Letters became a conduit for emotions that could not yet be expressed openly. Handwritten notes, exchanged with careful discretion, held thoughts, reflections, and musings that were deeply personal. Each word was chosen deliberately, every phrase layered with meaning. The audience can feel the tension as Serafina and Lucian explored emotions through ink and paper, a private dialogue that strengthened their bond while keeping their world outwardly unchanged. Even in physical proximity, intimacy remained nuanced, a hand brushing against another over a shared document, the brief contact of fingers when handing over a book, the closeness of leaning across a table. All were small gestures charged with significance. These fleeting moments heightened awareness, stirring emotions that Serafina could not easily categorize yet could not ignore. Their emotional connection deepened over time. Conversations extended late into the evening, filled with reflection, challenge, and subtle vulnerability. Lucian shared glimpses of his past, lessons learned through hardship, and perspectives that questioned conventional morality. Serafina reciprocated, revealing thoughts and feelings she had long kept private, exploring ambitions, desires, and doubts. Each exchange strengthened their bond, making their connection both profound and fraught with risk. For the audience, the tension is compelling because it is layered and deliberate. Romance here is not simply physical or immediate, it is cerebral, emotional, and psychologically charged. Every glance, note, and exchange is a careful interplay of attraction, strategy, and understanding. An intimate dance that underscores the story's moral and emotional complexity. Even as their connection deepened, Serafina was acutely aware of the boundaries she was testing. She recognized the thrill of emotional closeness, the temptation of desire, and the responsibility of loyalty. These elements combine to create a suspenseful tension, one that promises intrigue, emotional depth, and the unfolding consequences of choices driven by both heart and intellect. Serafina Holloway's mind had always thrived on structure and foresight, and now it found a purpose more consuming than any corporate challenge. Every detail of Oren's life became data. His routines, patterns, and moments of predictability were noted with careful precision. From his morning jogs to his interactions at the station, Serafina cataloged it all, aware that a single misstep in observation could unravel even the most meticulous design. She also immersed herself in legal frameworks. Contracts, municipal codes, and procedural loopholes were not simply academic studies, they were tools. Every regulation was dissected for vulnerability, every clause examined for opportunity. Serafina understood that intelligence alone was insufficient. Success required exploiting knowledge without leaving traces that could implicate her. Timing, she realized, was everything. Each action had to align perfectly with Oren's schedule, community routines, and the subtle rhythm of life in Birmingham. Alibis became part of the plan, invisible yet critical. Serafina considered every possibility, imagining how her presence elsewhere could be documented, how her movements could be justified, and how her life could appear unblemished while unseen strategies unfolded in parallel. Even casual outings were evaluated for potential misinterpretation. Her mind, always analytical, now worked overtime, running simulations in private, testing each scenario until it satisfied her standards of perfection. This phase of planning was slow, deliberate, and methodical. She kept meticulous notes, coded and compartmentalized in ways that only she could understand. Every day brought small refinements, adjustments to timing, subtle shifts in approach, and recalibrations as new information emerged. The process was both thrilling and dangerous, a mental game where the stakes were her life, her freedom, and the very fabric of the world she had built. Lucian's presence in this early stage was peripheral but significant. Though he had not yet been fully incorporated into her strategies, the bond they had begun to cultivate made him a quiet source of validation. His intellect mirrored hers, and the thrill of discovery in their conversations sharpened her ability to anticipate outcomes and consider risks in ways Oren's predictable routine could not. The audience begins to see that this was no simple decision. Serafina's planning combined brilliance, daring, and a growing willingness to traverse moral gray areas. In the quiet hours of her study, Serafina's mind became a battlefield of possibilities. She approached the problem like a grand game of chess, where every piece represented a variable: Oren's schedule, community activity, unforeseen interruptions, and the unpredictable behavior of others. Each move had consequences, each decision a ripple that could strengthen or destroy the plan she envisioned. Her calculations were painstaking. She ran scenarios repeatedly, testing outcomes with the same rigor she applied to complex business strategies. What if Oren arrived home early? What if a neighbor noticed an anomaly? What if a small misstep led to suspicion? Every potential risk was examined, dissected, and countered with contingency measures that often seemed improbable but necessary. The tension in these mental exercises was intense. Even the smallest error could collapse the entire design. suspense became part of her daily existence. Ordinary moments, grocery shopping, work meetings, and casual conversations were reframed as opportunities to test her assumptions and gather insight. Serafina's mind was simultaneously consumed with minutiae and elevated to overarching strategy, balancing the immediate and long-term with precision. The audience feels the danger not through overt action but through the intensity of her planning, the silent stakes that hang over every careful thought. Her intellect functioned as both shield and weapon. She anticipated responses, manipulated perceptions, and calculated probabilities with a focus that left no margin for error. Each decision was deliberate, each adjustment a refinement of the mental map she had constructed. Her brilliance became an engine of suspense, drawing the audience into the tension of her unseen maneuvers. Yet even as she controlled the variables, there was an underlying acknowledgement that risk was unavoidable. Life, she realized, had a way of introducing chaos that no intellect could fully predict. That awareness, combined with her strategic rigor, made each step thrilling and terrifying. The audience begins to understand that the stakes are not only personal, but profoundly consequential. Any miscalculation could irrevocably alter lives, trust, and moral boundaries. Lucian's influence lingered in these calculations. The subtle confidence he inspired reinforced her resolve, sharpening her instincts and allowing her to consider risks with a measured daring that only someone who understood her intellect could encourage. Their bond, intellectual and emotional, became entwined with strategy itself, heightening both suspense and stakes. By day, Serafina was the embodiment of grace, warmth, and attentiveness. She moved through her home with effortless charm, preparing meals, engaging Oren in thoughtful conversation, and participating in social events with a poise that inspired admiration. Every word, every gesture, was carefully measured to reinforce trust, maintain appearances, and protect the delicate balance of her household. To friends and neighbors, she was perfection personified. Yet behind this carefully constructed exterior, another life unfolded. Every outing, every late-night research session, every conversation with Lucian carried a hidden purpose. She meticulously compartmentalized her time, ensuring that her dual existence remained invisible. Where Oren saw a devoted spouse, Serafina's mind was occupied with contingency plans, potential vulnerabilities, and the unfolding architecture of her strategy. The contrast was stark and deliberate. At home, her laughter was genuine, her presence nurturing, and her attention unwavering. Outside, she navigated the unseen layers of the plan, calculating risks, refining timing, and exploring opportunities with Lucian's guidance. Each interaction in the external world was a deliberate step in a sequence only she fully understood. The audience experiences the tension of living two lives simultaneously, one grounded in loyalty and civility, the other in ambition, desire, and moral risk. The duality was exhausting yet exhilarating. Maintaining composure while plotting required discipline and focus. Any lapse could expose her intentions and unravel months of careful preparation. Even minor deviations, a delayed response, a miscalculated glance, a forgotten note, had the potential to create suspicion. Every action became both a performance and a calculation, blending social grace with strategic precision. This juxtaposition heightened suspense for the audience. The tension of Serafina's life lay not in overt conflict, but in the ever-present possibility of discovery. It was in these quiet, high-stakes moments that her brilliance and daring intersected with desire and ambition, creating a story of moral complexity, risk, and human vulnerability. Lucian's role was subtle but critical. Even when not physically present, his insights and perspectives shaped her decisions. Their shared understanding reinforced the duality of her existence, deepening both intimacy and stakes. Each secret discussion, carefully coded gesture, or shared observation reinforced the invisible thread connecting her two lives, making the audience acutely aware that every choice carried weight. Lucian's presence in Serafina's life had evolved beyond the intellectual and strategic. He had become a confidant, someone with whom she could share fragments of thought, too dangerous or delicate to reveal to anyone else. Their conversations, once casual explorations of literature and philosophy, now delved into the moral, the practical, and the intimate. Each exchange strengthened trust, and with trust came both risk and exhilaration. He listened without judgment, offering insight without condescension. Lucian's ability to analyze a situation, foresee consequences, and provide guidance allowed Serafina to refine her strategies with unprecedented clarity. What was once a mental game became collaborative. He suggested alternatives, pointed out vulnerabilities she might have missed, and challenged her to think several steps ahead. Their shared problem-solving became a private world, hidden from Oren, where intellect and ambition intertwined. This partnership increased the stakes. Emotional investment added complexity to the plan, creating pressure and vulnerability. Each decision now carried consequences not only for her own freedom, but for the trust and bond between them. Lucian's encouragement, subtle validation, and occasional reminders of calculated restraint intensified the emotional and moral tension. The audience feels that this is no ordinary alliance. This is a fusion of intellect, desire, and risk, where missteps could have severe repercussions. Intimacy grew through the quiet details, a knowing glance across the table, a hand briefly brushing another during shared work, or carefully timed notes that conveyed both strategy and sentiment. These interactions reinforced their connection without exposing them, creating a tension that was both emotional and psychological. The thrill of shared secrecy magnified the stakes, heightening suspense and drawing the audience deeper into the narrative. Lucian's role also tested Serafina's self-control. While he provided insight and encouragement, he also became a mirror to her desires, reflecting what she wanted and feared. The audience can sense the growing push and pull, her loyalty to Oren, the thrill of forbidden connection, and the pressure of ambition converging in moments of quiet intensity. Every choice became an exercise in discipline, foresight, and moral negotiation. Through this partnership, the narrative reinforces the story's central tension: brilliance and desire, intellect and emotion, ambition and morality are not separate. They intersect in ways that challenge both character and audience. The plan, while precise and calculated, is now inseparable from the emotional dynamics that bind Serafina and Lucian, creating suspense and anticipation for what is yet to come. As the plan solidified, Serafina felt the weight of every decision pressing down with increasing intensity. Each detail, timing, observation, legal nuance was accounted for, yet the emotional stakes grew with equal force. Lucian's presence, the intellectual bond, and the quiet intimacy they shared had transformed the plan from abstract strategy into something deeply personal and morally fraught. The audience is now drawn into a question that hovers above every scene. If faced with the same choices, how far would you go? This moment invites reflection. If you were in her shoes, could you resist temptation or follow desire? It is a question that resonates on multiple levels: ambition versus morality, intellect versus emotion, and loyalty versus longing. Serafina herself wrestled with it daily, weighing the thrill of possibility against the cost of betrayal. The audience is compelled to consider their own responses, to imagine the complexity of choices that blend intellect, passion, and risk. Suspense peaks here not through action, but through awareness. Every interaction with Oren, every meeting with Lucian, and every solitary calculation in Serafina's mind carries consequence. The duality of her life, the outward warmth and charm contrasted with the hidden plotting, creates a tension that is palpable without being overt. It is a slow-burning fire, one that threatens to consume both personal relationships and moral boundaries. The chapter closes on a quiet but profound note. Serafina's planning has reached a level of sophistication that rivals her intellect and creativity, yet the human element, the pull of desire, the danger of discovery, and the emotional stakes remains unpredictable. The audience is left poised on the edge of anticipation, aware that the next step could either solidify her control or unleash consequences beyond calculation. By combining strategic brilliance with human complexity, the narrative prepares viewers for the dramatic shifts ahead. Serafina's story is no longer simply about planning a course of action. It is about navigating desire, ethics, and risk in a world where every choice has a shadow and every bond carries weight. The chapter closes, leaving the audience eager for the unfolding drama and the next phase of her journey. Serafina Holloway had mastered the art of influence without leaving a trace. Every conversation, every gesture, every carefully timed remark was designed to shape perception and control outcomes. At home, she was the perfect spouse, attentive, affectionate, and engaging. She anticipated Oren's needs, complimented his accomplishments, and offered warmth that reinforced trust and admiration. Yet beneath this veneer, every interaction was carefully measured, a subtle maneuver to ensure her plans remained undetected. In the community, she applied the same skill with quiet precision. Invitations to events, casual conversations with neighbors, and seemingly innocuous social interactions were all opportunities to observe, influence, and maintain appearances. Serafina's charm became both armor and instrument. She was admired, respected, and seen as entirely trustworthy, even as her inner workings plotted in a parallel reality. This manipulation was subtle, almost imperceptible. A compliment here, a slight omission there, a well-timed question designed to glean information, all of it contributed to her awareness of potential threats and opportunities. The audience sees the duality, a woman admired by all yet secretly orchestrating events with careful intent. It is a testament to her intellect and patience, creating suspense as each small maneuver builds toward larger consequences. Even minor interactions became strategic exercises. When a friend confided a concern or a neighbor asked an opinion, Serafina responded with empathy and precision. Every word was selected to maintain trust, gather insight, and subtly reinforce her control over perception. The audience senses the tension because what appears ordinary carries layers of intention, and every relationship has the potential to expose or protect the secrets she guards so carefully. The stakes of these manipulations were high. Each misstep could unravel months of careful planning, creating suspicion and jeopardizing both strategy and safety. Yet Serafina thrived in this tension. It was a test of intellect, patience, and foresight, and she navigated it with the skill of someone accustomed to operating in the shadows while maintaining a flawless public persona. In a town like Birmingham, news traveled quietly but efficiently. Neighbors noticed the smallest changes, the unusual hours Serafina kept, the sudden attention she paid to minor details, or the faint tension in Oren's expressions. While nothing was overtly alarming, the collective awareness of subtle shifts began to stir curiosity. The audience is drawn into the tension because in small communities, perception often carries more weight than fact. Gossip, though indirect, took root. Friends commented on her frequent errands, strangers observed her meticulous composure, and colleagues at professional gatherings whispered about the unusual precision of her routines. Yet none could point to wrongdoing. Everything remained within the boundaries of what seemed normal. This ambiguity created suspense, as the audience understands that awareness alone can influence behavior and decisions. The reactions were varied. Some admired Serafina's efficiency and charm, attributing her routines to ambition and intelligence. Others felt an unspoken unease, sensing a subtle intensity that hinted at secrets concealed behind the warmth. These small ripples of observation reinforced the story's tension, demonstrating that even a carefully constructed facade can attract attention in ways the manipulator may not fully anticipate. Serafina recognized these subtleties and incorporated them into her strategy. Each glance, each whisper, each question became data. She adjusted her behavior, timing, and interactions to preserve appearances while continuing her unseen work. The audience witnesses her mastery of perception, the careful calibration of public image, and the delicate balance required to navigate both observation and secrecy. Small-town dynamics heightened the stakes. In a close-knit environment, Even the smallest deviation could invite scrutiny, yet the intricacy of Serafina's planning allowed her to maintain control. The suspense grows as the audience realizes that the community's attention, however indirect, is another variable in a complex web of planning, risk, and emotional tension. Every interaction carries weight, and every observer, no matter how casual, becomes part of the narrative's unfolding drama. At home, Serafina continued to embody warmth, affection, and attentiveness. Every smile, every gesture, and every careful word reinforced the trust Oren placed in her. She was the perfect partner, engaging, supportive, and attentive to the rhythm of their shared life. Her devotion appeared genuine, and it was, at least in part, but it was also a layer of protection for the plan she nurtured in secrecy. Outside the home, her existence took a starkly different form. She meticulously followed the schedule of her planning, leaving no detail unattended. Each step, whether observing Oren's interactions at the station, monitoring local routines, or refining her alibis, was executed with calculated precision. The audience feels the tension of a woman leading two entirely different lives, each requiring full attention and complete mastery. The duality was exhausting yet necessary. Public charm and private strategy demanded discipline, foresight, and constant vigilance. Serafina moved seamlessly between these worlds, aware that any small misalignment could expose her intentions. Even casual conversations became opportunities to test reactions, gather information, or refine her approach, creating a narrative rich with suspense and psychological tension. This contrast also deepened her internal struggle. The warmth and loyalty she displayed at home were genuine in their intention to maintain peace and connection, yet they coexisted with ambition, desire, and an unyielding drive to control outcomes outside the home. The audience senses the complexity of her character, intelligent, deliberate, and morally conflicted, making her both compelling and unpredictable. Every act, whether tender or tactical, carried risk. A misstep in charm could arouse suspicion. A miscalculation in planning could unravel months of preparation. The careful orchestration of these dual lives demonstrates not only Serafina's brilliance, but also the tension inherent in balancing morality, desire, and ambition in a world where both observation and action carry consequences. Lucian's presence had evolved beyond guidance. He had become an essential part of Serafina's internal strategy. Their relationship, initially intellectual, now carried emotional weight and moral complexity. He offered insight into timing, potential reactions, and subtle manipulations, guiding her decisions while simultaneously deepening the stakes of every action she considered. He was careful, strategic, and deeply aware of the risks. Lucian's calm composure contrasted Serafina's anxious thrill, reinforcing her confidence while reminding her of the danger inherent in every step. Their discussions were no longer theoretical. They addressed real scenarios, weighing consequences and exploring contingencies. Every recommendation he made was informed by a deep understanding of human behavior, amplifying the suspense for both Serafina and the audience. This growing collaboration intensified their emotional bond. Shared secrets, quiet observations, and deliberate exchanges became a subtle but powerful intimacy. Lucian's support validated Serafina's ambitions and desires while simultaneously testing her discipline. The audience senses that their connection is as much about trust and complicity as it is about attraction, creating a tension that is both psychological and moral. Even outside their private interactions, the echo of Lucian's influence shaped her choices. Small decisions, timing errands, orchestrating social engagements, or evaluating Oren's behavior were informed by the conversations they shared. The stakes were no longer solely practical, they had become personal and emotional. Every misstep could compromise not only her strategy but also the fragile trust and intimacy they had cultivated. Through this partnership, the narrative emphasizes the interplay between intellect, desire, and risk. Lucian is no longer a mere observer or advisor. He is a catalyst, amplifying both suspense and the moral tension of Serafina's choices. The audience is drawn into the unfolding complexity, aware that the convergence of emotional connection and strategic collaboration could lead to outcomes both thrilling and dangerous. As the quiet tension in Birmingham grew, Serafina felt the weight of every decision pressing down with increasing intensity. Her dual existence, charming spouse at home, calculating strategist in secret, left little room for error. Each interaction, each choice, and each observation carried consequences that extended far beyond her immediate life. The audience is drawn into a question that lingers over every moment. If you were in her shoes, could you resist temptation, or would desire guide your hand? This reflection is more than rhetorical. The thrill of connection with Lucien, the excitement of strategy, and the allure of intellectual and emotional intimacy pulls Serafina into territory that challenges both morality and loyalty. Every day brings subtle tests of discipline, a glance, a shared secret, a fleeting moment of understanding that could escalate into more. The audience is invited to consider the human complexity of desire, ambition, and consequence. Small-town observations add to the suspense. Though nothing outwardly incriminating occurs, neighbors and colleagues know changes in demeanor, routine, and social rhythm. The awareness of scrutiny, however vague, heightens Serafina's need for precision, increasing tension for both her and the audience. Every subtle manipulation is a calculated risk, and the consequences of exposure could be catastrophic. The chapter closes with a carefully poised cliffhanger. Serafina's planning has reached a critical juncture. Strategies are in place, confidants are trusted, and emotional stakes are high. Yet one unpredictable factor, human behavior, loyalty, or unforeseen circumstance, remains outside her control. The audience is left anticipating the unfolding drama, aware that the convergence of intellect, desire, and risk will soon demand choices that could change everything. Through reflection, suspense, and moral tension, this chapter emphasizes the core themes of the story: brilliance and desire, ambition and restraint, secrecy and consequence. The audience is both witness and participant, drawn into a narrative that questions what it means to navigate temptation, loyalty, and the cost of calculated decisions. The first hint that Serafina's intricate world might be under scrutiny came not as a dramatic revelation but as a quiet ripple. Financial irregularities, minor inconsistencies in routine documentation, and unexplained communications drew the attention of federal authorities. The audience senses the tension immediately. What had been meticulously hidden in plain sight was now registering on the radar of professionals trained to detect patterns and anomalies. FBI agents approached the situation cautiously. They observed without interfering, compiling data and noting subtle discrepancies. The investigation was methodical, almost clinical, yet even the professionals could not ignore the faint, yet consistent pattern of calculated behavior. Every account, every interaction, and every movement in Serafina's daily life was now subject to scrutiny, though nothing overtly incriminating had emerged. The small signs that triggered suspicion were deceptively ordinary: a slightly unusual purchase, a scheduled absence that coincided with unexpected events, or an interaction with someone of interest. All were minor individually, yet when aggregated, they suggested careful planning and potential concealment. The audience begins to understand that Serafina's brilliance, which had allowed her to maintain a flawless public persona, also made her actions more intriguing and harder to predict. Tension built as the agents pieced together patterns. Each observation raised questions that demanded careful interpretation. Why had Serafina been in certain locations at specific times? How did her movements align with Oren's schedule? Could coincidences explain the anomalies, or was there a deeper orchestration at play? The suspense is psychological, drawing the audience into a game of intellect and deduction that mirrors the one Serafina plays daily. The stakes were high but subtle. The FBI did not yet know the extent of Serafina's ambition or the precise nature of her strategy. Even so, the awareness of potential observation forced her to refine plans, increase caution, and anticipate scrutiny in ways she had not initially considered. The narrative tension heightens, demonstrating that in a world of intelligence and calculation, even a small imperfection can invite attention and challenge control. The FBI team approached the case with meticulous care. Each transaction, communication, and social interaction was cataloged, analyzed, and compared against historical patterns. What initially appeared mundane began to form a pattern that hinted at deliberate orchestration. The agents' curiosity deepened, driven by a blend of professional instinct and intrigue, as they realized they were observing a person of exceptional intelligence, operating beneath the surface of normalcy. They noted Serafina's precision in timing and social maneuvering. Her home, professional interactions, and public behavior appeared flawless, yet subtle anomalies. Carefully timed absences, unusual correspondence, and interactions that seemed to skirt conventional explanation triggered a quiet alarm. The audience feels suspense grow as the skilled observation of professionals begins to intersect with the calculated secrecy of Serafina's life. The agents began constructing hypothetical scenarios to explain the data. Was there financial malfeasance, hidden relationships, or a carefully executed plan of manipulation? Each theory required careful validation, and each observation brought new questions. For the audience, this process mirrors the tension in Serafina's dual existence, creating a parallel narrative of intellect versus investigation. Every small detail gained significance. A delayed phone call, a brief interaction with Lucien, or even a minor change in Oren's schedule became potential indicators of concealed activity. The suspense was cumulative. With each discovery, the stakes escalated, highlighting the precarious nature of Serafina's carefully constructed facade. The audience senses the growing possibility of exposure, yet the genius of her planning makes prediction difficult. Serafina, ever perceptive, sensed subtle shifts in the social and observational environment. Though the FBI remained largely behind the scenes, she adjusted her routines, reinforced alibis, and deepened her secrecy. The interplay between her calculated brilliance and the agent's methodical scrutiny intensified tension for the audience, underscoring the narrative's central themes: intelligence, desire, and the ever-present risk of discovery. Serafina sensed, with her usual precision, that someone was observing the rhythms of her life. The awareness was quiet but insistent, like a shadow at the edge of vision. Small changes in patterns, an unexpected phone call, a delayed delivery, or a fleeting glance from someone in the neighborhood, made her reconsider routines, refine strategies, and increase caution. The audience is drawn into a tension that is as psychological as it is suspenseful, understanding that even the most subtle observation can trigger ripple effects. Her daily life became a careful choreography. Every interaction with Oren was executed with perfect balance, attentive, affectionate, and unassuming, yet mentally catalogued against. Potential scrutiny, public appearances, errands, and professional responsibilities were all reviewed, with contingencies considered for every conceivable scenario. The suspense builds because the audience recognizes that a single overlooked variable could threaten the delicate equilibrium she maintains. Even interactions with Lucien became more calculated. Messages were phrased to avoid raising suspicion, meetings timed to coincide with plausible coincidences, and shared strategies were executed with caution. Each choice was a blend of intellectual precision and emotional restraint, revealing both her brilliance and the psychological pressure she faced. The audience experiences the stakes not through overt danger but through the silent, persistent tension of living under watchful eyes. Subtle changes in Oren's behavior, combined with minor shifts in community perception, heighten the stakes further. Serafina's awareness of observation, though indirect, was enough to test her discipline and adaptability. Every glance, every remark, every minor adjustment became a calculated move in an invisible game. The narrative emphasizes that in this world, mastery is defined not just by action, but by anticipation and perception. The suspense is continuous, fueled by the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. Serafina's ability to maintain composure while recalibrating her plans demonstrates both intelligence and audacity. For the audience, the tension is gripping. The closer one watches her life, the more apparent it becomes that her brilliance, ambition, and desires are all poised on a knife's edge, waiting for the first misstep to ignite consequences. As the investigation deepened, the FBI team began connecting seemingly unrelated details. Each observation, minor discrepancy, and pattern in Serafina's behavior formed a mosaic that suggested intentional design. The audience feels the suspense intensify. The brilliance that had protected her also attracted professional attention, forcing her to anticipate scrutiny she could not fully control. Agents discussed anomalies quietly among themselves, weighing probabilities and testing hypotheses. A small, unexplained absence here, a coded message there, a deviation in Oren's routine. These tiny indicators combined into a picture that was subtle yet compelling. For professionals trained to detect patterns, the invisible threads of planning became increasingly tangible, creating tension for both investigators and audience. Serafina's awareness of surveillance and analysis shaped her behavior. She tightened routines, adjusted alibis, and refined her schedule to avoid detection. Every encounter was calibrated, every interaction a test of control. The audience senses that even the smallest misstep could unravel months of careful planning, heightening anticipation and engagement. The psychological stakes deepened as both sides navigated a complex interplay of intellect and intuition. While the FBI pieced together potential motives and vulnerabilities, Serafina relied on anticipation, observation, and adaptability to maintain her cover. The suspense is continuous as the audience realizes the extraordinary tension between a calculated mind and highly skilled investigators. Subtle maneuvers, careful timing, and the faintest awareness of oversight transformed ordinary days into high-stakes exercises. The narrative emphasizes that in a world of intelligence, secrecy, and human unpredictability, even brilliance cannot fully control the outcome. Every observation, both by Serafina and by the FBI, becomes a strategic move, reinforcing suspense and the inevitability of potential discovery. As the web of observation tightened, Serafina felt the mounting pressure of invisible eyes. Every careful maneuver, every meticulously planned interaction now carried the possibility of exposure. The audience is invited to reflect. If you were in her position, could you maintain composure while your carefully constructed world teetered under scrutiny? This question mirrors her internal struggle and invites viewers to engage emotionally with her moral and strategic dilemma. The dual tension, external observation and internal desire, was relentless. Oren remained blissfully unaware. Lucien offered support and insight, and yet the quiet scrutiny of the FBI introduced an element beyond her control. The audience experiences the suspense as Serafina navigates daily life with grace and precision, all while knowing that one misstep could have irreversible consequences. Subtle indicators, once minor, now assumed greater significance. A neighbor's casual question, a delayed phone response, or an unexpected visitor became potential cracks in the facade. Each moment carried weight, and each decision was both a test of intellect and an exercise in restraint. The suspense deepens as the audience senses that while Serafina may be brilliant, human behavior is inherently unpredictable, and even the best laid plans are vulnerable to exposure. The FBI's attention, though not fully revealed to her, is imminent and growing. Every interaction Serafina undertakes now contains a hidden layer of risk, setting the stage for dramatic consequences. The audience is left questioning not only what she will do next, but how her intellect, ambition, and emotional entanglements will guide or betray her in the moments to come. Through this convergence of strategy, observation, and moral tension, the chapter emphasizes the stakes of secrecy, intelligence, and desire. The narrative prepares viewers for the next phase, where choices made in quiet calculation will confront the unpredictability of human behavior, authority, and consequence. The quiet moments between Serafina and Lucian carried a gravity that was both thrilling and dangerous. Every glance, every subtle gesture, and every shared thought became a silent acknowledgement of connection that neither could fully articulate aloud. Their conversations, once purely intellectual, now ventured into the territory of emotion, shared vulnerabilities, dreams, and ambitions that few outside this private world could understand. Lucian became more than a confidant. He was a mirror to Serafina's desires and fears. In his presence, she felt the freedom to explore the complexity of her ambitions without judgment, a rare relief that allowed her intellect and heart to coexist. The audience begins to understand that. Their bond is not simply romantic. It is a dynamic interplay of trust, desire, and psychological tension, which heightens both suspense and empathy. Their intimacy grew through subtle acts, lingering discussions in quiet corners of cafes, coded messages that conveyed both strategy and sentiment, and brief moments of physical connection carefully measured to avoid exposure. Each interaction was both an indulgence and a calculated risk, creating a tension that permeated every scene. The audience is drawn into a world where the smallest details, touches, glances, and shared silences carry monumental weight. The emotional complexity was magnified by the stakes of their situation. Serafina's dual life, Oren's trust, and the ever-present scrutiny of the community and authorities created a constant undercurrent of pressure. Lucian's presence offered both reassurance and temptation, pulling her into a moral and emotional conflict she could not fully resolve. The audience experiences the suspense not through overt action, but through the delicate balance of intimacy, desire, and strategic caution. This bond, forged in secrecy and mutual understanding, illuminated the human core of Serafina's story. It was a connection that provided validation, excitement, and companionship, while simultaneously challenging her discipline, morality, and long-term objectives. The audience feels the magnetic tension, intellect and desire, trust and secrecy, all interwoven in ways that define the narrative's emotional depth. Serafina's heart was a battleground. Loyalty to Oren, the man who had trusted her completely, clashed relentlessly with the magnetic pull of Lucian, whose presence awakened both desire and intellectual excitement. Each interaction with Lucian heightened her internal struggle, forcing her to balance morality with ambition and passion with prudence. The audience feels the tension in every glance, every carefully coded word, and every fleeting moment of connection. Her desire was not impulsive, it was calculated, a slow-burning realization of emotional and intellectual resonance with Lucian, yet with every step closer, the stakes escalated. Betrayal of trust was no longer hypothetical. It was tangible, pressing, and suffused with moral weight. Serafina's mind raced to justify, rationalize, and anticipate consequences, creating a suspense that was both psychological and deeply human. Even in moments of intimacy, her conscience whispered warnings, a lingering touch, a shared secret, a private smile. Each was a delicate negotiation between the thrill of connection and the peril of exposure. The audience senses that these moments, while small, carry monumental consequences, threading desire into the moral fabric of the narrative. Lucian, aware of the boundaries yet unable to suppress the growing tension, mirrored her restraint and understanding. Their push and pull was subtle. Intellectual debates became charged with emotional subtext. Conversations about strategy and ambition blurred into private confessions of longing and curiosity. This duality reinforced both suspense and empathy, compelling the audience to consider the human cost of desire entwined with secrecy. The narrative emphasizes that emotional complexity is inseparable from consequence. Every choice Serafina made in these intimate interactions carried risk of discovery, risk of guilt, risk of unraveling the careful strategy she had painstakingly constructed. The audience witnesses the internal stakes as vividly as the external ones, understanding that in this story, love and strategy are not separate. they collide in ways that are unpredictable, compelling, and morally ambiguous. Serafina and Lucien's connection thrived in the quiet details. A glance across a crowded room, a seemingly innocent note slipped between documents, or a carefully timed message sent under the guise of strategy conveyed layers of intimacy invisible to the outside world. These small gestures created a private language, a shared understanding that reinforced trust, attraction, and complicity. Coded communication became a form of thrill and discipline. Each word carried multiple layers of meaning, information about planning, emotional signals, or gentle reassurance, all delivered without arousing suspicion. The audience feels the pulse of tension, the thrill of secrecy intertwined with the magnetism of their bond. Every subtle exchange heightened suspense and drew viewers deeper into their complex dynamic. Physical gestures were measured and deliberate. A brief touch on the hand, a guiding hand on a shoulder, or a shared laugh that lingered longer than necessary, all carried emotional weight. Each act was intimate yet restrained, balancing desire against the necessity of caution. The audience senses the magnitude of these moments, understanding that even minimal contact carries consequences when lives, plans, and reputations are at stake. Their emotional bond deepened through conversation as well. Discussions of literature, philosophy, and ambition often morphed into exchanges of vulnerability, trust, and unspoken longing. The interplay between intellect and emotion created a tension that was invisible to everyone but them. Yet every interaction subtly shifted the balance between loyalty and desire, strategy and passion. Through these subtle romantic and emotional connections, the narrative emphasizes the duality of Serafina's life. Love, desire, and intimacy coexist with strategy, secrecy, and risk. The audience experiences the suspense not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet, charged moments where human connection and ambition intersect, reinforcing both tension and empathy. The weight of secrecy and desire began to press on Serafina in ways that were both subtle and profound. Every choice she made, every moment spent with Lucien, every calculated act in her dual life, carried consequences that rippled across her mind and heart. The audience senses a tension that is no longer only external. The true suspense is now internal, anchored in morality, emotion, and consequence. She felt the cost of divided loyalty acutely. Oren's trust, unbroken and genuine, became both a comfort and a source of guilt. Each private moment with Lucien intensified the moral stakes, creating internal conflicts that were impossible to ignore. The audience is invited to reflect on the complexity of human desire and the subtle ways it intersects with ethical boundaries. The emotional consequences extended beyond guilt. Serafina's heart, intellect, and ambition collided in unpredictable ways. The exhilaration of secret intimacy, the thrill of strategizing with Lucien, and the persistent fear of exposure combined to create a tension that was almost unbearable. Every day became a careful negotiation between desire and restraint, intellect and morality, secrecy, passion, and ambition, while thrilling, come with risks that cannot be fully controlled. The audience is drawn into the anticipation. How will Serafina navigate these converging pressures? What choices will she make when the equilibrium she has so carefully maintained begins to falter? Serafina's emotional journey is intertwined with the strategic one. The tension between love, loyalty, desire, and risk remains unresolved. The audience is left poised on the edge, aware that the next chapter will test her intellect, her heart, and her capacity for moral decision-making in ways that will define the trajectory of the story. The consequences of Serafina's choices finally crystallized. The careful balance of desire, strategy, and secrecy could no longer hold. Subtle missteps, unforeseen variables, and human unpredictability converged, revealing the cost of ambition untempered by ethical reflection. Oren's growing awareness, combined with the FBI's persistent observation, illuminated the reality that no brilliance, no matter how precise, can fully escape accountability. Serafina's emotional journey mirrored the unraveling of her strategic plans. The intimate connection with Lucien, The thrill of secrecy and the exercise of intellect all collided with the weight of consequence. The story emphasizes that actions motivated purely by desire, even when calculated, carry emotional, relational, and moral ramifications. The audience is reminded that human complexity, love, ambition, loyalty, and temptation cannot be fully mastered or predicted. The moral lessons are clear. Secrecy carries risk. Hidden intentions inevitably create vulnerabilities. Desire without accountability has consequences. Choices fueled by passion affect lives and relationships. Trust and honesty are invaluable. Betrayal erodes personal integrity and bonds. Intelligence without empathy is dangerous. Brilliance must be balanced with moral responsibility. As the story reaches its resolution, the suspense and emotional tension settle into reflection. Serafina's brilliance remains undeniable, but so too does the cost of her choices. The audience is left with both a cautionary tale and an invitation to examine the moral dimensions of ambition, desire, and human connection. Finally, dear viewers, if this story captivated you, inspired reflection, or kept you on the edge of your seat, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your engagement helps bring more thought-provoking, thrilling stories like this to life. Join the conversation. What would you have done in Serafina's shoes? Could desire justify ambition, or is loyalty always the greater path? Story 2. Ashbrook was a town where people still waved to each other from their porches. Mornings began with the sound of church bells, and evenings ended with porch lights glowing across the valley like quiet stars. It was the kind of place where everyone believed they knew one another's hearts, and Sheriff Nolan Hayes was the man who held that belief together. For 15 years, Nolan had been the symbol of steadiness in Ashbrook. He was the one who calmed disputes before they grew into feuds, the one who stopped his patrol car to help a stranded motorist, the one who visited the school on career day so the children could see that honor still had a face. His handshake was firm, his word unwavering. When Nolan spoke, the town listened, but on a quiet afternoon in late autumn, everything that made him the town's pride began to crumble, not because of a criminal's act, but because of a single document that arrived in an unmarked envelope. The file looked harmless, a routine printout from the county's genealogical study program. Nolan had ordered a round of DNA tests to help verify certain identities for an old cold case record. He didn't think much of it. He'd done this sort of cross-checking dozens of times before. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat at his desk, and started flipping through the results. One name after another, one sample after another, and then his hand froze. 3 names stood out: Elara Hayes, Sienna Hayes, Kieran Hayes, his children. Next to them were coded numerical identifiers that linked to 2 profiles, his and another. For a second, Nolan assumed there had been a clerical mistake. DNA databases often produced errors if data was entered twice. He adjusted his glasses, leaned closer, and reread the figures. The numbers didn't change. The match wasn't to him. It was to Darian Hayes, his younger brother. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the office floor. The sound barely registered against the roaring silence in his head. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at the paper as though his own heartbeat were scrawled across it. The room seemed to shrink. The air thickened. His first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Surely this was some absurd coincidence, a mix-up in the database, perhaps a duplicated sample mislabeled by the lab technician. His mind reached for any explanation that didn't demand he face the truth printed before him. He reread the file again and again, searching for an escape in the numbers. There was none. What he held in his hands was not just data. It was the collapse of everything he believed about his life, his marriage, and his family. The man who had taught him to ride bikes, who had stood beside him as best man at his wedding, who had been his closest confidant, That man was, according to science, the father of his children. For a long time, Nolan didn't move. Outside his window, the late afternoon light shifted across the street. A delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Life continued, oblivious to the moment his own had changed. There's a particular kind of silence that follows heartbreak, the kind that fills a room even when no one is speaking. That's what Nolan carried home that evening. The drive from the sheriff's station to his house felt longer than usual. He didn't remember the stop, signs, or the winding turns that led down Cedar Ridge Road. His hands were gripping the steering wheel, but his mind was somewhere else, trapped in that office, staring at numbers that had no mercy. When he parked in the driveway, he saw the life he thought he knew reflected in front of him, the white porch swing moving gently in the wind, Celeste's garden tools resting near the steps, the faint sound of laughter coming from inside. The home he had built, the home that had been his pride, now looked like a stranger's house. He didn't walk in right away. He sat in the car watching shadows shift across the living room curtains and asked himself questions no husband should ever have to ask. If the people you loved most built their happiness on a lie, would you still call it love? If truth and loyalty stood on opposite sides, which would you choose? He finally stepped inside. Celeste was in the kitchen, humming softly, stirring a pot of soup. The twins were at the table working on homework, and Kieran was building something with small wooden blocks. They looked up and smiled when they saw him, the kind of warm, easy smiles that could melt away any bad day. But tonight, they didn't melt anything. They pierced him. He smiled back, though it didn't reach his eyes. His heart whispered questions louder than any words spoken aloud. How long had Celeste carried this secret? Had it been guilt that made her so quiet on certain nights? And Darian, his brother, had every visit, every laugh, every memory been tainted by this truth he never knew? Celeste noticed his distant gaze and tilted her head. "You okay?" she asked, her voice calm, unaware of the hurricane behind his stare. "Yeah," Nolan said softly, "just tired. Long day." He kissed her cheek out of habit, and for the first time, it felt like an act of deceit. He excused himself and went upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind him. The sound of his children laughing downstairs felt almost cruel, a melody of innocence in a house that no longer felt innocent. He sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. Every oath he'd taken as a sheriff echoed in his mind, words like honor, truth, justice. He'd sworn to protect others from lies. Now he couldn't even protect himself from one. And then came the thoughts he didn't want to have, the thoughts that scared good people. What if Celeste wasn't the only one who knew? What if Darian had told someone? What if others in town suspected before he did? The humiliation of it burned through him. In a community as close-knit as Ashbrook, whispers traveled faster than truth. He pictured the knowing glances, the half-finished sentences, the pity disguised as politeness. But deeper than shame was pain, the kind that sits under your ribs and doesn't leave. Still, amid the anger and confusion, one truth refused to change. He loved his children. Whatever the test said, they were his. The ones who ran into his arms, who called him Dad, who had his habits, his discipline, his heart. Science could measure bloodlines, but not love. He clung to that thought as though it were the only thing keeping him steady. That night, as the house grew quiet, Nolan lay awake staring at the ceiling. The same ceiling he'd painted years ago when they first moved in. He remembered Celeste holding the ladder, laughing when a drop of paint landed on his nose. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone naive, untouched by betrayal. He turned to her, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, unaware of the war raging a few inches away. He wondered how many nights she had done the same, pretending everything was fine while carrying a secret heavy enough to destroy them. Forgiveness wasn't just about moving on. It was about rebuilding trust brick by brick after watching it collapse. And in that moment, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to start rebuilding. He closed his eyes, whispering to the dark, God, if this is a test, show me how to pass it without losing who I am. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, carrying the soft rustle of leaves. Inside, a man of law wrestled with a truth no law could fix. The morning after the DNA results, Ashbrook felt different, not in the air or the weather, but in Nolan's perception of it. The town had always seemed peaceful, kids riding bikes down Maple Lane, the coffee shop owner waving at passers-by, the sound of a church bell marking the hours. Yet now, every sight and sound seemed sharpened, like the world itself was aware of his secret. At the sheriff's office, Nolan sat at his desk, the report folder still lying where he had left it. The pale light filtering through the blinds cut across the paper, illuminating the words he wished he could unread. He had spent his career studying evidence, tracing facts, finding truths buried beneath lies. But this was a truth he didn't ask for. The knock on his office door made him straighten. It was his deputy, Mara Jensen, carrying her usual cup of black coffee. "Morning, Sheriff. You look like you've been up all night," she said lightly, setting the cup on his desk. "Just couldn't sleep," he replied, forcing a small smile. "You're not sick, are you?" she teased. "Because if you are, I'll have to call the mayor and tell him our rock finally cracked." He almost chuckled but caught himself. "No, just a lot on my mind." She nodded, taking the hint that something was off but not pressing further. She was sharp, too sharp, and he knew he'd have to keep his composure. The last thing he needed was for someone at the office to sense that something personal was wrong. When Mara left, he exhaled deeply. He needed to think like a sheriff, not a husband. He needed clarity, procedure, control, the things that had always kept him steady. But how do you investigate your own family? How do you separate emotion from truth when both share the same last name? That question stayed with him all day. Later that afternoon, as he was reviewing case files, his phone buzzed. A text from Darian flashed across the screen. "Hey, big brother, you free tonight? Thinking about stopping by. Been a while." Nolan stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Yeah, come over, we'll talk." It was the first time in his life that those 3 words felt like a threat. Darian arrived just after sunset. The last colors of daylight faded behind him as he parked his truck near the fence. Nolan watched from the porch, the wooden boards creaking under his boots. "Still keeping that sheriff stance, huh?" Darian joked as he climbed the steps. "Can't tell if you're about to arrest me or hug me." "Maybe both," Nolan said flatly. Darian grinned, brushing it off like he always did when things felt tense. He looked the same, the easy smile, the confident walk, that familiar air of charm that had always drawn people to him. But tonight, Nolan saw something else in his brother's face, the possibility of betrayal. They sat outside, the sounds of crickets filling the pauses. Celeste was inside with the kids, unaware of the storm brewing on the porch. "So," Darian said, leaning back, "how things been? You look tired. Everything okay?" Nolan studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of discomfort. But Darian's eyes were steady, casual, maybe even too casual. "I've had a long week," Nolan replied. "You ever get that feeling where you think you know someone, but realize you might not know them at all?" Darian laughed softly. "That's deep. You sound like one of those mystery writers." Nolan didn't laugh. "Yeah, it's not a joke." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. Darian's smile faded slightly, his brows pulling together. "You're talking about Celeste." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I'm talking about you, Darian." The space between them seemed to shrink. The sounds of the night, the rustling leaves, the chirping insects, faded under the weight of that accusation. "What are you saying?" Darian asked slowly. "I'm saying I got some results back today." "DNA results," Nolan said, his voice measured, each word carrying the weight of disbelief and fury. "And according to those results, my children, the ones I've raised, loved, and protected, aren't mine. They're yours." For the first time, Darian's expression broke. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked like someone who had been punched in the gut. "That can't be right," he muttered. "Nolan, that's..." That's impossible. I wish it were, Nolan said, his tone steady but his hands trembling slightly on his knees. But the tests don't lie. Darian stood abruptly, pacing near the steps. Celeste, she wouldn't. Don't, Nolan snapped, his voice cutting through the night. Don't say her name like you don't already know what happened. Just tell me the truth. I don't know what to tell you, Darian said helplessly. If something happened, and I'm not saying it did, it wasn't planned. You've got to believe me. Nolan rose to his feet, closing the distance between them. How long? He demanded. How long have you been lying to me? I haven't been lying. Then what do you call this? Nolan's voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. What do you call making me a fool in my own home? Darian's eyes filled with regret. You think I meant for this to happen? I've made mistakes, Nolan, but I swear on everything. I never wanted to hurt you. For a long time, neither man spoke. The quiet between them was louder than any shouting could have been. Finally, Nolan stepped back, his voice low. You already did. He turned and walked inside, leaving Darian standing on the porch, motionless. He looked at his children, sleeping peacefully. Ilara curled up with her stuffed bear, Sienna sprawled across the blanket, Kieran snoring softly. They looked so innocent, so untouched by the cruelty of adult choices. In that moment, he made a promise to himself. He would protect them no matter what, even if it meant burying the truth. But as he turned off the light, a whisper of doubt crept into his mind. Could secrets ever stay buried in a town that watched everything? The next few days in Ashbrook passed with deceptive calm. To anyone else, it was life as usual, morning routines, small-town chatter, the local diner filled with the same faces. But for Nolan Hayes, every sound, every glance, every word seemed loaded with meaning. He carried the weight of two lives, the one the town saw and the one breaking apart behind closed doors. At work, his badge gleamed on his chest as always, but to him it felt heavier. He investigated burglaries, resolved disputes, attended council meetings, all while trying to keep his personal storm hidden. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the noise of duty faded, his thoughts always circled back to the same unbearable truth. His children bore another man's blood, his brothers. Celeste, too, carried her guilt in silence. The glow she once had, the soft warmth in her eyes when she looked at Nolan, had dimmed. She moved through the house carefully, like someone afraid of stepping on glass. She cooked dinner, helped with homework, smiled when the kids looked, but her smile never reached her eyes. Nolan noticed. He noticed everything. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, he stood by the fireplace, staring at the framed family portrait on the mantel. The picture had been taken 3 years ago. Ilara missing one front tooth, Sienna's braid crooked, Kieran gripping his mother's hand like he never wanted to let go. He remembered how proud he'd felt that day, a man who had built something worth protecting. Now, that same image felt like evidence, a cruel reminder of a life built on someone else's truth. Celeste entered the room quietly, her steps hesitant. Nolan, she began, her voice almost a whisper, can we talk? He didn't turn around. Talk about what? You know what? There was a long pause. Then he said, I need to hear it from you. Celeste's breath caught. Nolan, please, it's not what you think. He faced her now, eyes sharp, hurt swimming beneath his composure. Then what is it, Celeste? Because right now, what I think is that you and my brother betrayed everything I believed in. Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't planned. You were gone so much back then. The night shifts, the call-outs, the late hours. I felt like you were a ghost in your own home. Darian was around, helping with the kids, fixing things. And one night, she stopped herself, voice cracking. I never meant for it to happen. It was one night, Nolan, just one, and I've hated myself for it every day since. The confession hit him like a blow. He'd imagined it, suspected it, but hearing it aloud made it real. One night, he repeated, his voice low. One night that took everything from me. Celeste stepped closer, desperate. I love you, Nolan. You have to believe that. You're their father. You always will be. Biology doesn't change love. He looked at her for a long time. His heart wanted to believe her, but his mind, the part that sought truth and order, couldn't let go. "You don't get to decide what's true anymore," he said finally. "Not after this." Celeste broke down, her sobs muffled against her hands, but Nolan turned away, unable to bear it. The next morning, the sky over Ashbrook was gray, heavy with the promise of a storm. At the sheriff's office, Nolan sat across from Deputy Mara, reviewing an unrelated case. A missing farmhand from the outskirts of town. "Left without notice," Mara said, flipping through notes. "Truck still at the property, wallet too. Locals say he was acting strange before he disappeared." "Any family?" Nolan asked. "Just an older sister in Brookvale. She said he'd been quiet lately, stressed." Nolan made a note. "Keep digging." As Mara left his office, Nolan stared at the missing persons report, but his thoughts were far away. The disappearance didn't feel random. It felt like something larger was at play. Maybe it was the sheriff's instinct, or maybe his own guilt coloring how he saw everything. But one thing was certain. Secrets were beginning to stack up in Ashbrook, and not all of them were his. Later that afternoon, as he drove home, he passed Darian's truck parked near the edge of the forest road. He slowed down, frowning. The engine was cold. The door was unlocked, but Darian was nowhere to be seen. He stepped out, calling, "Darian?" Only the sound of wind answered. Inside the truck, he found a half-finished coffee cup and an old photograph. One of the two brothers as kids, sitting on their father's porch, both grinning with scraped knees and messy hair. The picture had been folded down the middle, a faint tear running through it. A strange chill ran through Nolan. Darian might have been reckless, but he'd never just vanish. Not without a reason. He pocketed the photo, scanning the woods. "Where are you?" he murmured. That night, Nolan couldn't sleep. The rain had returned, drumming softly on the roof. Celeste slept fitfully beside him, her breathing uneven. Every few minutes, lightning flashed through the window, briefly illuminating the room. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text, unknown number. He reached for it and froze as he read, "Some truths are better left buried. Stop digging." There was no signature, no clue who sent it. He stared at the message, heart pounding. For the first time in his life, the sheriff of Ashbrook felt genuinely unsafe, not because of what others might do, but because of what he might discover next. The following morning, Nolan walked into the office early. The missing farmhand case had taken on new urgency. Something about that warning message, the disappearance, the folded photograph, told him the two were connected. He opened the file again, and this time noticed something he hadn't before: the missing man's last known employer. Nolan leaned back slowly in his chair, the pieces clicking together in a way that sent a cold rush through his chest. If Darian was involved in the disappearance, if the man had known something, he didn't finish the thought. The line between professional duty and personal truth was gone. That evening, as the sun sank behind Ashbrook's horizon, Nolan stood at the edge of his property, staring out toward the woods. Somewhere out there, his brother was missing. Somewhere out there, someone knew more than they were saying. He whispered to himself, "I swore to protect this town. But what if it's the people I love who need protecting from me?" And just like that, the sheriff who had spent his life keeping order realized he was standing at the edge of chaos. Ashbrook was the kind of town people rarely left, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. It was quiet, familiar, and filled with faces that never changed. The kind of place where people still waved when they passed on the road, and gossip traveled faster than the morning mail. At first glance, Ashbrook looked harmless. Tidy lawns, white fences, a church bell that rang every Sunday morning. But to anyone who'd lived there long enough, it wasn't hard to see the cracks in the perfection. The town had its share of secrets, some whispered, others buried. And Sheriff Nolan Hayes had kept those secrets safe until now. He'd grown up here, attended the same small school his kids went to, and walked the same forest paths that now made him uneasy. For years he'd been Ashbrook's symbol of stability, the man people trusted to keep them safe. But lately, safety felt like a fragile illusion. Every time he drove through Main Street, he could feel eyes following his cruiser. The townsfolk's smiles had changed, polite but cautious. Conversations would pause when he entered the diner. Even old friends avoided his gaze for a beat too long. Word had spread. Maybe not the full truth, but enough. People talked about trouble in the Hayes family. They speculated about Celeste, about Darian's sudden disappearance, about Nolan's late nights at the station. In small towns like Ashbrook, it didn't take facts to destroy a reputation, only whispers repeated often enough. One afternoon, Nolan walked into Bridges Hardware, where he'd known the owner, old Mr. Kavanaugh, for 20 years. The old man greeted him kindly, but there was something careful in his tone. Nolan hesitated. "Just some family stuff," he said. Mr. Kavanaugh nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "Family stuff," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "Hope it all works out." It was small interactions like that, polite but heavy, that made Nolan realize the truth wasn't going to stay buried for long. At home, things were just as strained. The kids noticed the distance even if they didn't understand it. Dinner conversations had become shorter. Celeste moved quietly around the house, as if afraid to disturb the silence that had settled between them. Ilara, the more observant twin, asked one night, "Dad, are you mad at Mom?" The question broke his heart. He forced a smile. "No, sweetheart, just tired." But children, especially smart ones, always know when the grown-ups are lying. Outside their home, the tension in Ashbrook deepened. Posters of the missing farmhand began appearing on telephone poles. Volunteers joined search efforts in the nearby woods. Nolan coordinated the operation himself, determined to stay professional. But as days passed with no sign of Darian or the missing man, doubt began to creep in. Was Darian connected to the disappearance, or was someone trying to make it look that way? One night, while reviewing search maps, Nolan received another text from the same unknown number. He found out what he shouldn't have. "You're next." Nolan's hands tightened around the phone. The message was more direct this time. A threat, not a warning. He immediately checked on his family. Celeste was asleep, the kids safe in their rooms. Still, he double-checked every lock, every window, his training kicking in even as his thoughts spiraled toward fear. That night, as he stood at the window watching the rain pour down, he caught a flicker of movement near the tree line. A figure, tall, motionless, half hidden in the shadows. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his heart pounding. "Hey," he shouted. "Who's out there?" No answer. The light swept across wet leaves, branches, and mist, but by the time he reached the spot, whoever had been there was gone. Only footprints remained, leading deeper into the woods. He followed them a few paces before stopping. His instincts told him this wasn't the time. Whoever was watching knew the land better than he did in the dark. Still, one thought stayed with him as he turned back toward the house. Someone in Ashbrook was playing a dangerous game, and they knew too much about his family. The next morning, he stopped by the station earlier than usual. Deputy Mara was already there, flipping through reports. "Any updates?" he asked. "Nothing good," she said. "We found tire tracks near the quarry. They matched Darian's truck, and the missing farmhand's wallet was found nearby." Nolan froze. "You're sure?" "Positive. But there's more." She handed him a small evidence bag. Inside, a folded photograph, wet and torn. It was the same childhood photo he'd found in Darian's truck. Only this one had his own face scratched out. For a long time he didn't speak. Then quietly he said, "This isn't just about family anymore." Mara frowned. "You think it's connected to the town?" "I think someone wants to destroy what's left of it." That evening, Nolan sat alone in his office long after everyone had gone home. He stared at the photo, the DNA results, and the growing stack of reports. Every page told a story of loyalty, betrayal, and the kind of secrets people would do anything to protect. He knew he couldn't keep the truth hidden forever, not from the town, not from his children, and not from himself. But before he could face that storm, he had to find Darian. Wherever his brother was, answers would follow. The church bell rang in the distance, echoing through the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thunder rumbled. The story of Ashbrook, of the sheriff, his brother, and the family built on deception was only beginning, and by the time it ended, 2 lives would be gone and the rest would never be the same again. Nolan Hayes was the kind of man people in Ashbrook trusted without question. He had that steady presence, calm, direct, and grounded. When he spoke, people listened. When he made a promise, they believed him. Over the years, he'd built his life around a simple philosophy: protect the innocent, honor his word, and never let personal feelings interfere with duty. But duty came with a cost. Every morning, Nolan woke before sunrise, long before anyone else in the house stirred. He liked those early hours, the stillness before the world demanded anything from him. The sound of the coffee maker, the low hum of the heater, the faint scent of pine from the forest beyond his window. Those quiet rituals kept him balanced. On his way to the station, he'd drive through Main Street, past the bakery, the old fire station, and the school playground. He'd wave to the few early risers already opening their shops. Everyone knew his truck. Everyone trusted it. He wasn't just Ashbrook's sheriff. He was part of its fabric, its peacekeeper, counselor, and sometimes silent witness to its private struggles. At 44, Nolan carried the look of someone who'd seen both the best and worst of people, yet still chose to believe in their goodness. His dark hair had begun to show streaks of gray, and faint lines etched his face from years of long shifts and sleepless nights. But his eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, remained calm, steady, the kind that put people at ease. His deputies admired him not for authority but for compassion. When a dispute broke out, Nolan rarely raised his voice. He'd listen first, often finding a way to ease tension before it turned into something worse. He believed justice wasn't just about law, it was about humanity. Yet beneath that professionalism, Nolan carried his own private doubts. The job had changed him more than he liked to admit. Over time, the emotional toll of seeing pain and conflict had left him weary. He often wondered if he was doing enough, not just as sheriff, but as a husband and father. At the station, his office reflected who he was: organized, methodical, yet warm. Family photos sat neatly on his desk, one from a summer picnic, another from the twins' school recital, and a faded snapshot of his wedding day. Every photo told a story of loyalty, love, and responsibility. Sometimes during late-night paperwork, Nolan would glance at those pictures, wondering if the man behind that family image still lived up to what they saw in him. He loved his family more than anything, but he knew how easily life could pull people in separate directions. Colleagues often described him as steady as stone. But stones over time crack under pressure, and Nolan's cracks were quietly forming. He just didn't know it yet. Celeste Hayes had a softness that drew people in, not just because of her gentle smile, but because of how she listened. She was the kind of woman who remembered the smallest details: how a neighbor liked her tea, how a friend's voice changed when they were worried, how Nolan's shoulders tensed when something weighed on his mind. For years, she had been the quiet strength behind the sheriff's badge. She managed the household, balanced 3 children's schedules, attended every community meeting, and still found time to bake for church fundraisers. To most of Ashbrook, Celeste was the model of grace: dependable, elegant, devoted. But beneath that calm surface, a different kind of silence lived, one born from loneliness. Her life with Nolan had once been filled with spark: midnight talks, impromptu weekend drives, shared laughter that made ordinary evenings feel special. But as the years passed, Nolan's responsibilities grew heavier, and their world began to revolve around routine. The love between them was still there, strong and unbroken, but it had quieted, like a once vibrant song now played at a lower volume. Celeste often sat on the porch at night, watching the faint lights of town flicker in the distance. She loved those moments: the cool wind, the sound of crickets, and the soft hum of life moving on. Sometimes she imagined Nolan sitting beside her, his hand finding hers like he used to, but more often than not, he was still at work, or too tired to talk when he came home. It wasn't resentment she felt, it was absence. She knew he loved her, but she missed the feeling of being loved, the excitement, the small surprises, the unspoken reassurance that she was still seen. When Darian, Nolan's younger brother, visited occasionally, he brought with him the energy that Celeste's life lacked. He was unpredictable, funny, carefree, always with a story that made everyone laugh. He'd help fix things around the house, tease the kids, and fill the air with easy warmth. Celeste admired him in a distant, cautious way. He reminded her of a time when life felt lighter, when she and Nolan were still discovering the world together. Darian's presence wasn't dangerous, but it was disruptive. He carried an ease that contrasted sharply with Nolan's quiet intensity. Sometimes Celeste caught herself feeling guilty for noticing. She was a loyal wife. She'd never imagined her heart could drift even for a second. But loneliness does strange things. It blurs lines, confuses the mind, and leaves room for small emotional cracks to form before anyone realizes they're there. Her days remained busy. Mornings began with school lunches and reminders to the twins about forgotten homework. Afternoons were spent running errands or volunteering at the library. Evenings were the hardest, when the house grew quiet and the space beside her on the couch felt too large. She'd glance at her reflection sometimes, in the kitchen window or a hallway mirror, and wonder when her smile had begun to look so practiced. Still, she stayed devoted. Her love for Nolan was real, and her loyalty to their family was unwavering. But deep down, she missed the version of herself who used to laugh without checking the clock, who believed her husband saw her not just as his wife, but as his partner, his equal. Celeste's story wasn't one of discontent. It was one of quiet endurance. She wanted nothing more than to hold her family together, even as she felt her own spirit drifting further away. That longing, gentle, unspoken, and human, would later become the thread that pulled every hidden truth to the surface. The Hayes home was never truly quiet when the children were around. Their laughter filled every hallway, their voices overlapping like a song only a family could understand. Ilara and Sienna, identical twins at 12, were inseparable. They shared everything, from whispered secrets under their blankets to silent glances that only sisters could interpret. Yet for all their similarities, they couldn't have been more different. Ilara was thoughtful, the kind of child who noticed when her father's tone softened or when her mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She loved stories about people, about what made them kind or cruel, brave or afraid. She'd spend hours reading beside the living room window, lost in books that made her imagine a world bigger than Ashbrook. Sienna, on the other hand, was fire. She questioned everything, challenged her teachers, and refused to do anything halfway. When she laughed, it echoed through the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. She adored her father, but also loved testing him, sneaking into his office to ask about his police work, or pretending to be a detective herself. Then there was Kieran, the youngest, only 8. He was quiet but curious, with a heart so tender that even small disappointments could bring tears to his eyes. He looked up to Nolan with absolute hero worship. To Kieran, his father wasn't just the sheriff. He was a symbol of everything right in the world. The 3 children brought life to the old Hayes home. Saturday mornings meant pancakes, syrup everywhere, and laughter loud enough to reach the yard. Evenings meant bedtime stories, soft music, and the gentle rhythm of a family that, despite small cracks, still believed in love. Celeste often said that her children were the glue holding everyone together. She wasn't wrong. Their innocence reminded Nolan of what mattered most, especially on the long nights when the world outside their home seemed too harsh. But as much as the children anchored the family, they also unknowingly reflected its unspoken tensions. Ilara had begun to sense that her parents' smiles sometimes felt rehearsed. She noticed the silence that hung between them after dinner, the way her father would linger by the window instead of sitting on the couch with her mother. She didn't understand it, but she felt it, that quiet distance that children can't explain but instinctively know. Sienna reacted differently. She grew louder, more expressive, almost as if her energy could fill whatever space was missing. When things grew tense, she'd crack a joke or drag everyone into a silly game, unaware she was doing what her father once did for his own parents years ago, using humor to hold a family together. And Kieran, sweet and unaware, saw only love. He believed every family had days when people were too tired to talk, and that hugs were enough to fix everything. His world was small but full of light. Bedtime hugs, his mother's humming, his sister's teasing laughter. Nolan often watched his children with quiet admiration. They were the best parts of him, he thought. When he returned home from long shifts, the sound of them running toward him erased the exhaustion of his day. It reminded him why he worked so hard, to give them safety, to build a world where innocence could thrive. But beneath those moments of joy, something delicate was beginning to shift. The twins were growing older, becoming more aware. Questions began to surface, innocent ones, but unsettling all the same. "Dad," Sienna once asked, "why do people whisper about you? And Uncle Darian sometimes?" Nolan brushed it off with a smile, but the question lingered in his mind long after bedtime. Alara, meanwhile, had begun keeping a small notebook, writing her thoughts about her family, the things she noticed but didn't understand. It was her way of processing what adults refused to say aloud. One day, that notebook would become a painful reminder of how early she'd sensed what everyone else chose to ignore. For now, though, the Hayes children lived in a world that still felt safe. Their parents' love was imperfect but present, and their days were filled with ordinary joys, bike rides, homework struggles, and whispered stories under the covers. They were the heart of the Hayes family, pure, trusting, and unaware that the truth waiting in the shadows would change everything they believed about love, loyalty, and family. Ashbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. It rested between long stretches of farmland and quiet woods, a place where people waved to each other at stop signs and where every rumor spread faster than wildfire. The town square was its heart. On weekday mornings, the smell of coffee drifted from the cafe near the courthouse, mingling with the sound of passing trucks and the low hum of conversation. The post office was a social hub. People didn't just mail letters there, they exchanged news. Some called it gossip, others called it community. Nolan Hayes had lived in Ashbrook his entire life. He knew every street name, every shortcut, every family story stretching back generations. Being sheriff here wasn't just a job, it was a responsibility built on personal trust. People saw Nolan not as an authority figure, but as a protector. "Sheriff Hayes always keeps his word," the locals often said. It was both a compliment and a burden. His family's history was woven deep into the town's foundation. His father had been a school teacher, his mother a church volunteer. The Hayes name carried weight, not from power, but from generations of reliability. That legacy was something Nolan took seriously, maybe too seriously. Ashbrook prided itself on stability. It was the kind of place where the church bells marked time, and traditions mattered. Every summer, the town hosted a fair that brought everyone together. Farmers, shop owners, teenagers with ice cream-stained hands. There was a comfort in its predictability, a sense that life here followed simple, unchanging rhythms. But stability has a cost. In towns like Ashbrook, privacy is an illusion. Secrets don't stay buried, they simply wait for the right whisper to resurface. Celeste often felt that weight more than her husband did. As the sheriff's wife, her life was constantly under quiet observation. Every choice she made, from how she dressed to who she spoke with, seemed to draw subtle judgment. People didn't mean harm, but their curiosity was relentless. At first, Celeste handled it with grace. She hosted bake sales, helped with charity drives, smiled through every conversation. But beneath that smile, she sometimes felt trapped. Not by Nolan, but by the image of perfection they were expected to maintain. The Hayes family wasn't just admired, they were the moral compass of Ashbrook. Every Sunday when they sat in the front pew of the old white church, people watched them, not out of malice, but out of expectation. They represented what every family wished to be: strong, loyal, unbreakable. And that, ironically, became the quiet source of their undoing, because when a family is seen as flawless, any imperfection becomes magnified. Nolan had begun noticing small shifts in how people interacted with him. When he'd walk into the cafe, conversations sometimes paused. He told himself it was nothing, Maybe people just respected his presence, but the subtle glances said otherwise. Ashbrook, for all its charm, was built on the illusion that everyone's lives were open books. But no one's story is ever fully read. Even the closest friends in town, like Nolan's deputy, Wyatt Crane, or Celeste's confidant, Marion Doyle, had moments when their loyalty blurred with curiosity. Questions about the Hayes family were whispered in kitchens, murmured across fences, and disguised as concern. "How's Celeste doing lately?" someone would ask. "She looks tired." Or, "The sheriff's been working long hours again. Hope everything's all right at home." They weren't malicious, but in small towns, compassion often walks hand in hand with intrusion. For Nolan, Ashbrook had always been a source of comfort, a place where justice and order were clear. But lately, it began to feel smaller. Every eye felt like a mirror, every conversation a test. Still, he remained dedicated. When crimes happened, missing livestock, small disputes, an occasional bar fight, Nolan handled them with calm efficiency. He loved his work, not for authority, but because it gave him purpose. His badge wasn't a symbol of power. It was a promise he made to his town, his family, and himself. Yet even he couldn't see how the very trust that bound Ashbrook together would soon turn against him. Because in a town where everyone believes they know the truth, the real truth often becomes the most dangerous secret of all. There is a slow kind of separation that arrives not with an argument, but with small absences. It begins as tiny things, a missed call, a sentence left unfinished, a look that starts and then stops. For Nolan and Celeste, the drift started that way, little omissions accumulating into a pattern neither of them noticed until it had weight. Nolan's work hours changed him, almost imperceptibly. Case files that once took an evening now bled into the nights. A fight over a trivial noise at 2 a.m, an abrupt call that pulled him from a family dinner, a town meeting that ran late. These were the stitches in a distance that grew between them. He carried home the residue of other people's troubles, the raw edges of arguments he'd quelled, the tired faces of those he had helped. He meant to set them down at the front door, but sometimes they clung to his sleeves. Celeste, who had once delighted in spontaneous moments, found herself smoothing the household into a rhythm. She scheduled playdates, coordinated school projects, and made sure the house ran on its quiet engine. In the spaces where conversation had once flowed, practical tasks took over: laundry, lunches, bills, dentist appointments. The romance remained, but like an old photograph, it was easy to touch without truly seeing. They both mistook busyness for normalcy. It was easier to explain away the missed touch or the curt answer than to call it what it was, a slow retreat. Nights became a time for separate routines. Nolan read reports at the kitchen table while Celeste trimmed the garden, both in the same room but not in the same story. They shared the house, not the current of each other's lives. The children felt the change before either parent would admit it. Elara began to watch her father with new attention, cataloging the way his jaw tightened when he read his phone, the way he paused when called by the station. Sienna compensated with louder laughter and antics that pulled everyone into an artificial togetherness. Kieran, small and earnest, still expected bedtime stories and tuck-ins, but he sometimes clung longer to his mother, as if trying to anchor a drifting boat. There were signs that could have been read as ordinary strain: a forgotten anniversary, a curt answer at the breakfast table, a postponed date. Each one alone fit a reasonable explanation. Together, they hinted at a deeper fatigue. Celeste would lay out his uniform the next morning and wonder when she'd last felt seen for reasons other than care of the household. Nolan, staring at a page in a report, would find himself reaching for the memory of a laugh he could no longer place. Ashbrook's rhythms made the drift feel less noticeable. Neighbors applauded the couple's attendance at the town fair, the Wayman's church bazaar, the children's recital, and they assumed that being seen together meant everything was fine. Public presence was its own kind of reassurance, but private distance does not always show under lights and applause. Small misunderstandings began to accumulate. Nolan, distracted after a late shift, missed the moment Celeste tried to talk about a childhood dream she'd been nursing, a class she wanted to take, a trip she wished they would try someday. He offered tired encouragement that sounded like politeness. Celeste folded her hopes away, saving them for an imagined future in which he had time to listen. She didn't resent him in those moments. She simply felt the ache of being postponed. Darian's intermittent visits moved into those spaces like a breeze through an open window. He was not malicious. He was simply present in a way that felt refreshingly immediate. He tinkered with the porch swing, offered to fix a leaky gutter, and listened with an easy attention that made Celeste relax in ways she had not acknowledged she needed. Those moments were brief and innocent at first, but repeated attentions can alter how someone perceives their day-to-day life. A laugh held a fraction longer, a conversation that lingered just beyond the ordinary, none of it dramatic, all of it meaningful. Nolan began to miss the small, telling details that once threaded his days together. He missed the way Celeste would hum while preparing dinner, the way the twins would create elaborate stories about space explorers, the way Kieran would place a toy sheriff hat on his head and salute. Those were not big events, they were the small stitches of belonging. When stitches come loose, a garment still appears intact until a breeze reveals a widening gap. The couple tried to correct course in simple ways. They scheduled a weekend away to a bed and breakfast a little over an hour from town. For a day, they found one another in a silence that was comfortable and old. They walked slow paths, ate long breakfasts, and seemed to remember how to be companions. On the drive home, they promised to change small habits, more dinners together, fewer late-night calls. Those vows felt genuine in the moment. Yet life's obligations re-entered with their familiar insistence, and the changes were hard to sustain. At times, guilt crept in for both of them. Nolan felt it when he watched Celeste working quietly in the garden after coming home from a 12-hour shift. Celeste felt it when Nolan offered to take the kids to a sporting practice she hadn't remembered arranging. They apologized through actions rather than conversations, assuming that doing would substitute for speaking. But apologies without the root conversation become a kind of papering over, neat and temporary. People noticed fatigue in others with surprising sensitivity. Mrs. Halverson from the church noticed that Celeste's eyes lost some of their sparkle and left her a pie with a note that read, "For you. Take an evening." Nolan's deputy, Mara, brought him a thermos of coffee one morning with the offhand remark, "You look like you could use the backup." Such kindnesses helped, but they also underscored how visible the strain had become. What made the cracks more fragile was the lack of explicit words. Neither Nolan nor Celeste feared confrontation in the way some couple do. They feared the shape of the answers. Speaking aloud felt like giving the distance a name, and naming it could make it something final. So they let small needs go unvoiced, and those unvoiced things formed a quiet ledger of loneliness. As minor as these moments were, they set the stage for the larger rupture. Human hearts are resilient, but they are not immune to being worn down by neglect disguised as responsibility. The everyday omissions, the unsaid, the postponed, the unattended, formed the architecture of loss. By the time the DNA results shattered the household's assumptions, those small fissures had already prepared a path for the shock to travel farther and faster than either of them could have imagined. Nolan's love for his family was not lessened by the distance. If anything, it complicated his grief. He loved what he had built, and he loved the people within it. That is what made each omission sharper. They were distances within a scaffold that had once felt unshakable. Celeste's longing did not erase her devotion. It merely added a depth to her regret that was ready to be exposed. When a family is strong in appearance but fragile in private moments, an unexpected revelation does not simply break, it exposes the pre-existing weaknesses. The routine wear of years, the quiet sacrifices, the small silences, all of them became part of the record that the DNA report would now interpret not only as fact, but as a symptom of a life left unattended. At the center of it all, the children continued to be children, unaware of the catalog of small losses adding up around them. They offered morning hugs, messy breakfast kisses, and the reckless joy of play. Their presence complicated the adults' choices in a way that made any move heavier, because change would affect not just two people, but three small lives too. This accumulation of tiny absences was not dramatic in itself. It was the quiet engine that made the shock to come so devastating. The family's sense of normalcy had been gradually reconfigured without notice, and when the truth finally landed, it did not find a pristine home to strike. It found a house already threaded with gaps. Sheriff Nolan Hayes had built his life on two promises: to protect his town and to protect his family. Both were sacred to him, bound by the same principles of duty, loyalty, and love. To most people in Ashbrook, he was the man you called when chaos broke out, steady, fair, and incorruptible. But behind that badge and uniform, Nolan was simply a man who wanted to do right by the people he loved most. Every morning began with quiet rituals that grounded him. He would rise before dawn, make coffee for himself and Celeste, and stand for a moment by the window that overlooked their front yard. From there, he could see the twins' bikes leaning against the fence and Kieran's baseball glove lying on the porch swing. Those small sights reminded him what he was working for, the safety and stability of those little lives. His pride wasn't in titles or medals. It was in the way his children ran to him when he got home. The feeling of small arms wrapping around his waist after a long shift was his truest reward. He never brought his frustrations into the house, no matter how heavy the day had been. He would kneel, smile, and listen as Sienna recounted a school story, or as Kieran showed off a new drawing of a superhero with a badge that looked suspiciously familiar. Celeste would watch those moments from the kitchen doorway, the soft light catching her face as she smiled. To Nolan, those looks were worth more than praise or promotions. He carried them like quiet medals of the heart. He often stayed late at work, not because he wanted to, but because Ashbrook trusted him too much. People relied on his presence. Yet each late night carried guilt. He knew Celeste waited up for him, sometimes with a book half read, pretending not to be tired. He noticed the small gestures, the dinner kept warm, the folded uniform, and he told himself he would repay the kindness on his next day off. That next day never came as often as he wished. Despite exhaustion, Nolan made time for fatherhood. He attended every school recital, even if he had to stand at the back of the auditorium in uniform. He once left an active case briefing to make it to Alara's piano recital on time, catching her final song. When she looked up and saw him in the crowd, the pride in her eyes reminded him that fatherhood was the most important badge he would ever wear. He didn't speak much about emotions, not out of coldness, but because he believed showing strength meant protecting those you love from worry. He was the calm in storms, the hand that steadied trembling shoulders. Celeste often told him he carried too much, but he'd just smile and say, "That's what I'm here for." It wasn't bravado, it was conviction. At church gatherings, people would nudge each other and whisper, "That's Sheriff Hayes, good man, good family." Nolan would politely nod, uncomfortable with the praise. He knew the cost of appearing perfect: sleepless nights, quiet sacrifices, and the unspoken weight of expectations. Yet he wore that weight willingly, convinced that his family's comfort was worth every ounce of it. To his children, he wasn't the sheriff. He was the man who built treehouses, fixed broken toys, and told bedtime stories that always ended with a lesson. Each story mirrored the principles he lived by: honesty, bravery, kindness. When Kieran once asked him what made someone good, Nolan had paused and said, "It's when you do the right thing, even if no one's watching." That line became something the children would repeat among themselves, an invisible family motto. But for all his strength, Nolan had blind spots. He didn't see how often Celeste's smile looked tired, how her laughter sometimes felt like an effort. He assumed his reliability was enough, that consistency could replace emotional presence. He never imagined that silence could be mistaken for distance. Still, he loved deeply, not through words, but through quiet gestures: refueling Celeste's car before she asked, repairing a broken fence at dawn, leaving notes for the twins wishing them luck before their school debates. Those acts were his language of affection, though he never realized how often unspoken love could go unnoticed. On weekends, he'd take the family on drives along Ashbrook's outskirts. They'd pass rolling fields and old barns, the twins singing in the back while Celeste rested her head against the window. Nolan's hand would rest briefly over hers between gear shifts, a touch that meant everything and nothing at once. It was his way of saying, "I'm here," even when words didn't come. To outsiders, Nolan had everything: a stable job, a loving wife, beautiful children, and the respect of a whole community. But internally, he sometimes felt a faint ache, the sense that despite all his efforts, something intangible was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't name it then, but it was the growing space between how things appeared and how they felt. Even in that uncertainty, he remained hopeful. He believed in the redeeming power of love, that families could weather distance, that effort could fix what time had worn thin. He told himself there would be time to slow down, to reconnect, to make up for all the lost evenings. He truly believed he was doing his best, and maybe that was the tragedy, that his best, though sincere, was not enough to shield him from what was coming, because when the DNA results would later land on his desk, when the truth would stand bare and merciless, the first emotion that would hit him would not be anger or betrayal. It would be heartbreak, not for the loss of pride or reputation, but for the memory of every small, beautiful moment he had fought so hard to protect. To understand Nolan Hayes is to see a man who loved fiercely, even when his love was quiet. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes born from exhaustion and assumption, but he never stopped believing that family was sacred. That belief, pure and stubborn, would make the coming revelation not only a shock to his world, but a fracture to his soul. Because when the strongest man breaks, it isn't loud, it's silent. Like the moment a house loses its foundation, still standing on the outside, already hollow within. Every few months, without warning, a familiar sound would echo up the gravel driveway of the Hayes family home, the low hum of a motorcycle, the kind of sound that drew attention even before the rider came into view. That sound meant one thing: Darian Hayes was back in town. Nolan's younger brother had a way of announcing his presence without saying a word. His arrival was always unplanned, always dramatic, and somehow always perfectly timed, right when the Hayes household had settled into its usual rhythm. Neighbors often described Darian as the adventurer who never stayed still. He'd disappear for months, sometimes years, chasing work in other states, photography gigs, construction jobs, odd stints in road shows. He had an unpolished charm, a smile that disarmed people, and a way of making every story sound larger than life. When Darian stepped off that motorcycle, the air seemed to shift, not because he brought trouble, but because he carried energy. His laughter was loud, his presence magnetic. He could make a stranger feel like a lifelong friend within 5 minutes of conversation. To Nolan, Darian was both a source of pride and frustration. He admired his brother's confidence and ability to make the best out of uncertainty, yet he worried about his lack of direction. While Nolan's life followed rules and routines, Darian's was guided by impulse. When he visited the Hayes home, the twins would rush out first, thrilled by his stories of wild adventures, hikes through mountains, nights under desert skies, encounters with people from places they'd only read about. Kieran, wide-eyed, would cling to every word, asking endless questions. Celeste would stand on the porch, her arms crossed, trying not to smile as Darian teased Nolan about his neatly pressed uniform or his perfectly trimmed lawn. "Still mowing in straight lines, big brother?" He'd joke, his grin playful, his tone affectionate. Nolan would roll his eyes, but deep down, he was glad to see him. "Someone has to keep things in order," he'd reply, half smiling. For a few days, the house felt lighter when Darian was around. He brought spontaneity, pizza nights instead of planned dinners, music instead of quiet evenings. He'd play guitar for the kids, tell exaggerated tales of near misses on the road, and somehow remind everyone what it felt like to live freely. Yet beneath all that laughter, a quiet difference lingered: discipline versus desire, order versus freedom. Nolan and Darian were raised by the same parents but shaped by opposite forces. Their late father had admired Nolan's structure and worried about Darian's wandering heart. That unspoken comparison had followed them into adulthood. Nolan respected structure. Darian craved experience. Nolan saw risk as something to minimize. Darian saw it as something to embrace. Still, they loved each other deeply. Family gatherings were filled with good-natured teasing. Yet there was always a flicker of tension, small, harmless on the surface, but waiting for the wrong spark to ignite. When Darian unpacked his bag that evening, placing it near the guest room door, Celeste offered him dinner. He smiled and said, "You always make this place feel like home, Cel." It was a casual remark, light, familiar, but it landed differently this time. There was warmth in his tone that wasn't inappropriate, but it carried familiarity beyond the ordinary. Celeste brushed it off with a polite laugh, but her eyes flickered briefly toward Nolan, who hadn't noticed. That's how it started. Subtle, unnoticed, harmless in the moment. And yet, for anyone paying close attention, something intangible had begun to stir. The kind of quiet shift that changes everything long before the truth ever surfaces. From the outside, Nolan and Darian Hayes were the picture of brotherhood. Two men who shared the same striking gray eyes, the same sharp jawline, and the same quiet confidence that came from their father. But to those who knew them closely, they couldn't have been more different. Nolan was the kind of man who believed that structure built character. From a young age, he planned every step, his studies, his career, even his future home. His childhood notebooks were filled with goals and schedules. He joined the police academy straight out of high school and built his reputation on reliability. People in Ashbrook said, "If Nolan promises something, it gets done." Darian, on the other hand, was born with a fire that refused to be contained. He was restless, driven by curiosity rather than obligation. While Nolan studied laws, Darian studied people. He wanted to understand what made them tick, their habits, their emotions, their stories. He would spend hours at the edge of town, sketching landscapes, photographing strangers, or learning a trade from whoever was willing to teach him. Their mother used to say, "Nolan builds the fence, Darian climbs over it to see what's beyond." Despite their differences, they were inseparable growing up. Nolan protected Darian from bullies. Darian pushed Nolan to loosen up. When Nolan earned top marks in school, Darian would clap the loudest. When Darian got into trouble, and he often did, Nolan was the one bailing him out. That dynamic continued into adulthood. Nolan's career as sheriff gave him authority and respect. He wore his badge with quiet pride, not as a symbol of power but as a reminder of duty. He was methodical, responsible, and deeply loyal, both to his town and his family. Darian's life was more fluid. He worked where he wanted, moved when he felt like it, and never stayed long enough to be tied down. To him, life wasn't about titles or ranks. It was about moments, and though people admired his charm, they often whispered that he lacked direction. Despite everything, Nolan loved his brother unconditionally. He envied, in a way, Darian's freedom, the ability to live without the weight of expectation. But envy is a strange thing. It hides behind affection until one day it reshapes how you see someone you love. When Darian came back to Ashbrook after one of his long absences, he'd bring laughter into Nolan's home. But once he left, an odd silence always lingered. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was something emotional, as though he'd taken a part of the family's warmth with him. Celeste noticed it too. Darian's visits reminded her of the days before responsibility had taken over, before routines, before expectations. He was spontaneous, funny, and attentive in ways Nolan rarely had time to be anymore. Not because Nolan didn't love her, but because he had given all of himself to duty. Still, Nolan never resented Darian's relationship with his family. If anything, he was grateful that his children adored their uncle. Darian's storytelling gave them color and excitement, something Nolan's disciplined world often lacked. But over time, Darian's freedom began to highlight Nolan's restraint. Each represented something the other secretly longed for. Nolan's order gave life meaning, but made it predictable. Darian's impulsiveness gave life energy, but made it unstable. It was this silent contrast, the tension between control and chaos, loyalty and longing, that became the invisible thread holding their relationship together. And like any thread stretched too far, it would eventually break. The brothers never argued about their differences, not directly. Their conflicts came in subtler ways, through their choices, their silences, and the people they loved. When Darian stayed over, Nolan would often wake up early to prepare breakfast, a quiet gesture of brotherly affection. But when he'd walk into the kitchen and find Darian already there, laughing softly with Celeste as they cooked together, something inside him would tighten. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. It was confusion, an unease he couldn't name. Darian wasn't doing anything wrong, but there was a closeness between him and Celeste that didn't belong to words. It lived in gestures, in familiarity, in the comfort of shared laughter that seemed effortless. Nolan brushed it aside. They're just family, he told himself. But a quiet voice in his mind whispered otherwise, a voice he didn't want to hear. That was the irony of their bond. Darian admired Nolan's discipline, while Nolan quietly envied Darian's ease. Yet, in trying to understand each other, they began to drift into a space neither was prepared for, a space where love, duty, and temptation blurred into something neither could control. When Darian returned to Ashbrook that autumn, it was meant to be a short visit, a few days to reconnect, to breathe, to escape the chaos of the city that had chewed him up and spat him out. He arrived unannounced as always in his worn-out truck coated with dust from a dozen forgotten highways. The moment his tires crunched against the gravel driveway of the Hayes residence, the house seemed to stir with life. Alara and Sienna came running out first, their laughter slicing through the quiet evening like sunlight through fog. Kieran, only 9, trailed behind, tripping over his shoelaces but grinning wide when his uncle swung him up into his arms. "Uncle Darian!" they chorused, their voices layered with genuine excitement. He spun them around until they squealed, then set them down gently. "You 3 get taller every time I blink," he said, his voice light, teasing, but full of warmth. Celeste came to the door, wiping her hands on a towel, her eyes widening with surprise and a trace of relief. "Darian Hayes," she said with a small smile. "You always show up right when we've stopped expecting you." He grinned. "Then I guess I've got good timing." Behind her, Nolan stepped into the doorway, his uniform jacket hung on the back of a chair, his badge gleaming faintly in the light from the hallway. "You never call ahead," he said, half a complaint, half an embrace in disguise. "Where's the fun in that?" Darian replied, holding his brother's gaze before stepping forward and pulling him into a quick hug. "You've gotten stiff, Sheriff, and you've gotten reckless," Nolan countered, though there was humor in his tone. The moment settled, a perfect balance between affection and unease. Inside, the house filled with conversation. Darian had always had a way of commanding attention without trying. The kids hung on every word as he told stories of distant places, the kind of tales that made their eyes shine. Celeste brought out lemonade and slices of apple pie, leaning against the counter as she listened. There was a familiarity between her and Darian that had always existed, a quiet ease. They had known each other long before she married Nolan, through family gatherings, teenage summers, and the slow evolution of shared memories. She watched him talk, his gestures animated, his laughter soft but contagious. He hadn't changed much, except that there was something tired in his eyes now, something hidden behind that easy grin. When Nolan joined them later, the rhythm of the evening shifted. He sat beside Celeste, his hand brushing hers, a reminder that they were still anchored together. But as he listened to Darian tell story after story, a part of him felt like an outsider in his own home. Darian made everyone laugh effortlessly. Nolan, though respected, struggled to bring that same lightness. His authority, the thing that made him so reliable in town, made him distant at home. The conversation drifted to the upcoming town fair, a tradition Ashbrook held every year. Celeste mentioned she was volunteering for the charity bake sale. You still make those cinnamon rolls that could make anyone confess to a crime? Darian teased. Celeste chuckled. You remember those? How could I forget? You used to make them after Nolan's shifts when he was too tired to eat dinner. Nolan looked up then, meeting his brother's eyes. The air between them thickened for just a second, a subtle reminder of shared history, both fond and fragile. Still do, Celeste added softly, breaking the silence. That night, when the children went to bed, the three adults stayed up talking by the fireplace. Darian had that effect. He made time feel slower, like the night wasn't racing anywhere. They reminisced about their childhoods, their parents, and the years before Nolan became sheriff. Darian spoke about the places he'd been, the diners, the motels, the towns that all blurred into each other. Sometimes, he said, staring into the fire, I envy you, Nolan. You've got roots, a family, people who need you. Me, I've just got stories. Nolan leaned back, his jaw tightening slightly. Roots come with responsibility. Sometimes I wish I could trade places with you for a week. Just live without answering to anyone. Darian smiled faintly. You wouldn't last 2 days without checking your radio. Celeste laughed quietly, the sound soft as falling leaves. The moment felt real. 3 people bound by memory, each finding comfort in the company of the others. But underneath that warmth, something fragile stirred. A thread of emotion that neither Celeste nor Darian could completely ignore. It wasn't desire, not in that moment. It was connection, a sense that they understood each other in ways Nolan didn't always see. Celeste saw Darian's loneliness, hidden behind his confidence. Darian saw her exhaustion, the quiet ache that came from years of routine. They didn't act on it, they didn't even speak of it. But it existed. An unspoken awareness that lingered after every laugh, every shared glance. She shook her head. Of course not. He's family. The kids adore him. Nolan nodded but didn't respond immediately. His instincts, sharpened by years of police work, told him something was off, not with Darian, but within himself. He kissed Celeste goodnight and turned in early, but long after the house went quiet, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing faint music from the guest room. Darian's old habit of humming before sleep. It was comforting, familiar, and complicated. Darian's visit changed the rhythm of their household in ways none of them noticed right away. He brought laughter but also reflection, the kind that made people question what they'd become. Celeste found herself looking forward to mornings again, Darian helping Kieran with his homework or teasing the twins over their music choices. Nolan found himself trying harder to match that warmth, to reclaim something that had quietly faded between him and his family. But something about Darian's presence lingered long after his laughter faded. It stirred dormant emotions, memories of freedom, passion, and choices left unexplored. It was this emotional shift, subtle but powerful, that would later define the storm to come. If Nolan Hayes was the town's guardian, Darian Hayes was its heartbeat. His arrival spread through Ashbrook like wind through autumn leaves. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Everyone had their own story about him, and somehow, every story painted him as both a hero and a troublemaker. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. It followed him naturally. Whether it was a casual visit to the local diner or a stop at the farmer's market, Darian had a way of making people feel seen. He remembered names, asked about their families, and listened, truly listened, as though their stories were the only ones that mattered. It was a quality Nolan admired, but also resented. At the diner one morning, Darian strolled in wearing his trademark grin, greeting the waitress like an old friend. "Morning, Carla. Still making the best pancakes in Ashbrook, or did someone finally challenge your title?" Carla laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "You'd disappear for years and come back acting like you never left. Coffee?" "You know it," Darian replied, sliding into a booth. Within minutes, 2 teenagers came over, asking if he was the sheriff's brother. Darian chuckled, answering their questions with that easy charm that made them hang on to every word. By the time Nolan arrived for his routine breakfast, Darian had already become the center of attention. The waitress poured his brother another cup of coffee and smiled. "You should be proud of him, Sheriff. Your brother's a delight." Nolan's polite smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, he's something. That moment. small as it was, said everything. Back at home, Celeste noticed the same pattern. Whenever Darian was around, people gravitated to him. The neighbors dropped by more often, bringing casseroles or excuses to talk. He volunteered at a community cleanup day without being asked, turning the tedious task into laughter-filled teamwork. Even Nolan's deputies spoke fondly of him. "Man, your brother could talk a confession out of a brick wall," one of them joked at the station. Nolan smirked, or charm it into staying quiet. He said it lightly, but the truth behind it wasn't lost on him. Darian's magnetism wasn't just social, it was emotional. People opened up around him, sometimes too easily. Celeste saw it most clearly during the town fair. The entire community had gathered at the park, the air filled with the scent of funnel cakes and roasted corn. Nolan was busy managing the security booth, checking permits, keeping order, always the watchful guardian. Darian, on the other hand, was chaos wrapped in charisma. He joined the pie-eating contest, helped a child win a stuffed bear, and even played guitar at the evening bonfire. The crowd loved him. They always had. Celeste watched from a distance, standing beside a friend. "He's got your husband's smile, but your husband's opposite energy," the friend whispered, half teasing. Celeste smiled, though her chest felt heavier than she expected. "Yes, that's exactly it. It wasn't jealousy, at least not in the conventional sense. It was the feeling of seeing something you've lost reflected in someone else." Darian carried a sense of lightness that reminded her of who she used to be, long before responsibility and expectation turned life into repetition. When the bonfire ended and families drifted home, Darian found Nolan packing up some equipment. "You handled that crowd like a general," Darian said. "Someone has to." Darian leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. "You ever tired of being the responsible one?" Nolan didn't look up. "You ever get tired of not being?" They both laughed, but there was tension underneath the sound. "You know," Darian said after a pause, "people in this town really look up to you. They feel safe because of you." Nolan finally met his gaze. "And they adore you because you make them forget what they're scared of." It was the most honest thing either of them had said that day. That night, back at the Hayes home, Celeste and Nolan sat in the kitchen while the kids slept. She could sense the heaviness in him. "You're quiet," she said gently. He sighed. "He just walks in, and everything changes, everyone lights up. I'm the sheriff, but he's the one they can't stop talking about." Celeste reached for his hand. "They admire you for different reasons. You keep things steady. Darian just makes things feel easy. Maybe too easy," Nolan muttered. "He's got a way of stirring things up without meaning to." She hesitated, wondering whether to tell him what she'd overheard earlier, how a group of women at the fair had been talking about Darian like he was some kind of local legend. But she decided against it. Nolan didn't need more fuel for his frustration. Instead, she said, "He'll be gone soon. Things will settle." Nolan nodded, but part of him wasn't so sure. Darian had a way of leaving traces, invisible emotional fingerprints that lingered long after he left a room. Days turned into weeks. Darian's visit stretched longer than anyone planned. He said he was helping a friend in town with some renovations, but it was clear he enjoyed being back. The familiar rhythm, the slower pace, the family dinners that ended in laughter. But with that comfort came complexity. Celeste caught herself glancing at him more often, not with desire, but with curiosity. There was something about his restlessness that drew her in. It reminded her of her younger self, the one who once had dreams of traveling before marriage anchored her. One evening, as she and Darian were clearing dishes, she said quietly, "You make people believe in second chances, you know that?" He raised an eyebrow. "Do I?" "You do. You walk in like the world hasn't beaten you down yet, like there's still time to change everything." He studied her for a moment. "And you talk like someone who stopped believing that a long time ago." The air stilled between them, not from attraction, but from recognition. Two people who understood, without saying a word, that life had pulled them in opposite directions. Before anything more could be said, Nolan's voice called from the living room. "Darian, you fixing to help me with the fence tomorrow?" Darian smiled, breaking the tension. Wouldn't miss it. By the end of that week, Darian had become more than just a visitor. He was a presence, woven into the town's daily rhythm, its laughter and its whispers. People began comparing the brothers openly. Some admired Nolan's steadiness, others were drawn to Darian's energy. Both were respected, but only one was loved. And that quiet distinction, invisible to most, began to weigh heavily on Nolan. The question now lingered in the minds of those who watched the Hayes family from afar. What happens when loyalty and temptation collide? Because while Nolan guarded the town with law and order, something far more unpredictable was taking shape inside his own home. An emotional current neither he nor Celeste fully understood, all set in motion by the brother who never meant to stay this long. The longer Darian stayed in Ashbrook, the more the air inside the Hayes home began to shift. It wasn't sudden or obvious, not the kind of change anyone could point to and say, "There, that's when things started to feel different." It was quiet, gradual, like watching daylight fade into evening without realizing when the color left the sky. At first, the change seemed harmless. Darian's laughter filled the house, drawing smiles from the twins, Ilara and Sienna, and their little brother, Kieran. He taught them card tricks, told them stories about faraway places, and played guitar while they sang along. Even Nolan couldn't deny how much the children adored their uncle. But slowly, something else began to stir. Not romance, not betrayal, but confusion. Celeste felt it first. She couldn't explain why, but every time Darian spoke, she caught herself listening a little too closely. He had a way of talking that reminded her of how Nolan used to be years ago, before the badge, before the long nights, before life became a series of duties and deadlines. Darian's words carried ease, warmth, unpredictability. The things she once loved in Nolan, the things she missed without realizing it. She didn't seek his company, but the house made it impossible to avoid. Some evenings, when Nolan worked late, Darian would be sitting at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee, asking about her day. Their conversations were simple, but comforting in ways they shouldn't have been. One evening, Celeste stood at the sink washing dishes. The sound of running water and distant crickets filled the silence. Darian leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her quietly. "You still hum when you're busy," he said softly. She turned, startled. "I didn't even notice." "You used to do that years ago," he continued. "When Nolan and I were teenagers, and you'd come over for dinner. You'd hum the same tune while helping Mom with the plates." Celeste smiled faintly. "You have a good memory." "I remember people better than events," Darian said. "People tell you who they are if you listen closely enough." She glanced back at the sink, unsure how to respond. There was nothing inappropriate in his tone, just an unsettling kind of sincerity, the kind that made her wonder what else he remembered. Meanwhile, Nolan was noticing the silence in his own way. He came home later than usual that night, tired from paperwork at the station. The house was dimly lit, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. Darian had gone out for a late walk. The kids were asleep, and Celeste sat alone at the table with a half-empty cup of tea. He kissed her forehead, sat down, and rubbed his temples. "Long day. They all are lately," she replied softly. He looked at her for a moment, searching her face for the warmth that used to greet him. "You all right?" "I'm fine." He wanted to believe her, but her tone carried distance, the kind that no words could disguise. Over the following days, Nolan began to sense patterns. He'd come home, and Darian would already be there, helping Celeste in the garden or entertaining the kids. He'd tell himself it was innocent, family helping family. But deep down, something didn't sit right. He started volunteering for more night shifts, not out of duty but avoidance. When he did come home, he'd find laughter echoing from the kitchen, Darian's voice blending with Celeste's, light and familiar. It wasn't flirtatious, just comfortable, too comfortable. He didn't confront it, not yet. Nolan wasn't a man of impulsive emotion. He preferred order, evidence, clarity. But what evidence could you find for something invisible? How do you measure the weight of glances, the length of pauses, or the sound of two voices blending too easily? One Saturday, the Hayes family gathered for a small barbecue. Friends from town joined them. Laughter, children playing, the smell of grilled corn in the air. Nolan kept to the grill, serving food, staying occupied. Across the yard, he saw Darian helping Celeste set up drinks. Their interaction was innocent, ordinary even, but there was something in their rhythm, a familiarity that struck Nolan deep. They moved around each other like people who shared an unspoken language. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, Nolan stood by the window, watching the faint glow of the garden lights. Celeste joined him, her hand brushing his arm. "You've been quiet," she said gently. He exhaled. "I just feel like I'm watching something change and I can't stop it." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe it's me, maybe I'm imagining things, but every time I see you and Darian talk, I feel..." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Forget it." Celeste hesitated. "You think there's something between us?" "I think there's a distance between us," he said, "and I don't know when it started." That truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Meanwhile, Darian noticed the tension too. He wasn't blind. Nolan's smiles had become forced, his tone clipped, his presence guarded. One evening, he found his brother sitting on the porch, staring at the empty road. "Something wrong?" Darian asked carefully. Nolan didn't look up. "You ever feel like you're losing control of your own life?" Darian leaned against the railing. "All the time. It's different for you," Nolan said. "You mess up and people forgive you. You disappear and they welcome you back. I make one mistake and it follows me forever." Darian didn't respond immediately. "Maybe you care too much about what people think. Maybe you don't care enough," Nolan said flatly. For a moment, neither spoke. Two brothers, both right in their own ways, both wrong in others. Darian finally sighed. "You think I'm getting in the way, don't you?" Nolan stayed silent. "That's what this is about," Darian continued. "You think Celeste and I..." "Don't," Nolan interrupted sharply. "Just don't." He stood up and walked inside, leaving Darian staring out into the darkness, guilt twisting in his chest. Because the truth was, he didn't mean to get between them. He'd never intended to stay long enough to cause any kind of fracture. But sometimes, the damage we do isn't from our choices, it's from our presence. From that point forward, the house felt different. Celeste tried to hold things together. Dinners, routines, polite conversations. But the warmth was fading. Nolan spoke less, smiled less, and when he did, it didn't reach his eyes. Darian grew quieter too, as if trying to make himself smaller. But his absence only made things feel emptier. The children felt it most. One night Kieran asked, "Is Uncle Darian mad at us?" Nolan looked up from his paperwork, caught off guard. "No, of course not." "Then why doesn't he play guitar anymore?" the boy asked softly. Nolan didn't have an answer. The distance had settled in, invisible, cold and heavy. What once felt like home now felt like waiting for something to break, or for someone to leave. The house that used to echo with laughter now carried the silence of three adults too afraid to say what they were feeling, and three children too young to understand what was slipping away. The warmth of family still lingered, but it was thinning, stretched across quiet nights, whispered doubts, and the ache of things left unsaid. And though no one spoke it aloud, all three of them, Nolan, Celeste, and Darian, felt the same unspoken truth pressing against their hearts. Love, even when it starts pure, can become complicated when left unguarded. In the weeks that followed, silence became the uninvited guest in the Hayes household. It crept in slowly, through missed breakfasts, quiet dinners, and conversations that ended before they began. The kind of silence that doesn't need shouting to be loud. Nolan, once the center of calm authority, began moving like a man uncertain of his own footing. His morning routine, coffee at dawn, a few minutes of stillness before the day began, no longer brought him peace. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the steam from his mug curling in front of him, staring into nothing. Celeste would pass by, offer a gentle greeting, and he'd reply with something clipped, not unkind, just distant. It was as though every word cost him something to say. The children noticed. Alara and Sienna whispered to each other at night, wondering why their parents didn't laugh as much anymore. Kieran, the youngest, began drawing pictures where everyone in the family stood apart, not touching, not smiling, just standing under separate clouds. Ashbrook was changing, or maybe it was just the Hayes family losing their place within it. The air inside their home grew heavier by the day, carrying words no one dared to say out loud. A silence that once meant peace now felt like distance. Nolan's uniform still commanded respect in town, but behind closed doors, the man inside it was unraveling. Trust had become a stranger in his home. The warmth that once held the family together was slipping through invisible cracks, and deep down, everyone felt it. But the real storm hadn't even started, because just when the truth seemed unbearable, something even more shocking was waiting to surface. A discovery that would turn love into suspicion, and family into strangers. So before you go, take a deep breath, because in part 2, what Sheriff Nolan Hayes finds next won't just question loyalty, it will redefine it. Don't miss part 2 of this story. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as the truth in Ashbrook takes a devastating turn.